Michael's huge hand shot out and grabbed Gerson by the throat, lifting him, gasping until his head hit the deck beams. He then moved in so that his face was right in that of Gerson's, his voice a quiet, menacing hiss. "Don't you talk of betrayal, or I'll be after telling our shipmates what you get up to when no one's looking. Now you will say nothing, and nor will I, but if I hear you have opened your big gob and split, you'll be the loser." "Belay, Michael, for the love of Christ," said Latimer, grabbing at his hand, for Gerson's pretty face was going blue. "You're choking the life out of the bugger." Michael let go, and Gerson dropped like a sack of peas in a heap on the planking, his hand rubbing his throat. "You heard me, Gerson, did you not?" That got a rasping noise and a nod. Charlie, who had always been wary of Michael O'Hagan, not least because he had felt his fist one night when the Irishman was drunk, had taken a couple of steps back, causing those he disturbed to curse him. "You said there was a reason, Michael," asked Rufus. "There is." "Is it a good enough one to leave us in the lurch?" It was a gentler Michael who put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "To tell the truth, Rufus, I don't know. For what is reason enough for one man can be seen as little to another. I need to think on that." "Are you going to tell us what it is?" "When we're back at sea, Rufus, then I'll tell you." "It won't do for me, whatever it is," said Charlie Taverner. That got a chorus of agreement, not much of one, for those who had been offended by Pearce's blatant self-interest had turned to other more pressing needs, like getting their pigtails greased and decorated, and airing their shore-going rig. Anything that would make them look good. This despite the fact that the brutes they were going to service would have had them in sackcloth, as long as they could pay. Emerging from the gates of the naval yard, John Pearce entered a world more familiar to him than that of any ship. The narrow streets were bustling with people hurrying to unknown destinations, weaving between carts drawn by hand or horse. The smell was the sweet, pungent odour of the manure that covered the cobbled roadway, driven into the gaps between the stones by a constant succession of wheels, of smoke from chimneys too sooted up for real safety, and a general whiff of corruption that went with humans in the mass. There were hawkers and traders in canvas-covered stalls filling every available wall space, the odd drab of a whore who would strut in what she supposed to be a seductive way whenever anyone emerged, too poor to do anything but offer her services in an alley, for the folk that emerged through these gates had coin, be they navy or dockies, and perhaps some of the latter were going home to an abode where what the emaciated whores could give them in a 2-minute tryst, for a 2-pence piece, was not available in the bed space of their own home. Even if Colborne had not surreptitiously pointed them out, Pearce would have spotted the sharp-eyed men lounging in various poses that allowed them a clear view of the gates, crimps and sharps, always on the lookout for a mark. No doubt they were familiar with the shore workers, the storemen and the navy clerks, and one or two would have an eye out for the signal that told them these men had something to sell, something they had purloined from the navy. The largest industrial enterprise in the land was a rich source of almost anything of which a thief could think. Failing that, even if the gate was an unlikely place of exit, they would be on the lookout for men who had no right to be where they were, which would have applied to John Pearce without a uniformed lieutenant walking a pace in front of him. Others would be hoping for some youngster in a blue coat who might have money from which he could be parted, either by guile or, if it could be done without retribution, by force, and that too would apply to any tar allowed ashore because his captain trusted him not to run. Not that either would be approached sober. Let them drink first, and copiously, for in their dull state they were an easier victim. Odd to think that Charlie Taverner had been one of that kind, something which Pearce had learnt from those who knew him rather than from Charlie's own lips. He could imagine him in this setting, hat tipped back, sandy hair showing, and a smile on his face, seeking by a welcome look to entice some stranger into his orbit. Pearce doubted, without any evidence, that Charlie was one to club an unfortunate once he had filled them with drink, more the kind to use sweet words and flattery to part them from their money, keeping himself fed in the process, before perhaps extracting a small loan. That was how he had worked John Pearce on that first acquaintance in the Pelican, which led him to wonder what inroads Charlie would have made into his money if the press gang had not intervened. Pride himself as he might on his prudence and wits, he knew that the likes of Charlie Taverner had means of parting any man from the contents of his purse. Clearly it had not worked on at least one occasion, the law-breaking being what confined him to the liberties of the Savoy, where Charlie could walk the few streets bounded by that sanction, and work, if he could find any that paid. The scene before him was a tableau which could be seen in every town in the land, and not for the first time Pearce was wont to wonder how many people tried to make their living, by fair means or foul, as parasites feeding on the body of a paying enterprise. It was not just dockyards that attracted such people. You could find them outside any manufactory where the workers received regular pay, in the centre of any market town where those with the means came to buy and sell. People hovering on the edge of life, trying to sustain themselves off the scraps of those who only had a little more. This had been the grist to his father's radical mill, the gap between rich and poor in a world where a man would not have to look too hard to find someone expired of starvation only yards away from the gates of houses full of fat merchants and numerous servants. Walking behind Colborne, he felt a faint twinge of the resentment that had so animated his father at such injustice, while at the same time reminding himself of something he had learnt in Paris, that when it came to change, it was not those at the bottom of the pile who effected anything, but people who had full bellies, time, and inclination. The only role the dispossessed were given to play was usually destructive. The shop they entered was dark and low-ceilinged, and the man who responded to the tinkling bell almost a caricature of the lowly tailor, in the way he was bent and obsequious, with a long tape measure round his collar, a man able to smile at Colborne and frown at John Pearce in what seemed to be the same look. There was a whole playlet in the fellow as he examined, in a fleeting second, the coat Pearce was wearing, the sneer at the torn-off collar, a slight change of expression as he realized that, despite the way it was marked and creased, the black cloth was of very good quality. The look did not last long, for this was a man who also knew a customer from a servant. "Lieutenant, how may I be of service to you?" Colborne indicated Pearce. "I want a midshipman's coat for this fellow, not a new one. In fact, quite well worn will do." "Ah." Colborne ignored a reply obviously designed to impart that such a matter was far from easy. "I know you keep such things, since I was obliged to purchase a used garment as a working coat myself not 2 months past." The lips pursed in a fleeting show of distaste. This was a man who enjoyed dealing with post-captains who could afford a 20-guinea gold-edged broadcloth, took some pleasure from lieutenants buying new if plain, but had little patience with impecunious midshipmen, and could barely bring himself to be civil to anyone seeking second-hand. He approached Pearce and stood under his chin. "Size will be a problem." "You will look." The shrug was eloquent if non-committal, but before he turned to go, a finger and thumb were used to feel the edge of the coat Pearce was wearing, one that had been bought for him by a woman in Paris, keen that her young and ardent lover should look like a gentleman, perhaps that her beauty should not be diminished by his less than perfect attire. It made him think of the hat that went with it, and the fine breeches and buckled shoes, as well as the beauty and accomplishments, both social and private, of Amélie Labordière, the person who had gifted them to him. A week after the purchase of that garment she had fled Paris with her husband, who had been a tax farmer under the old regime, to avoid arrest by the latest group of politicos to take charge of a revolution descending month by month into increasing chaos. Pearce recalled with some amusement how his father had disapproved mightily of both the giver and the gifts. But what son paid any heed to a parent where matters of love were concerned? Who gives up midshipmen's coats to be sold as seconds? Colborne did not look at him, too busy examining a captain's uniform on a dummy, complete with the twin epaulettes that denoted 3 years' seniority. "Any number of people. Imagine how many youngsters quit after one taste of a mid's berth." He stopped and looked at Pearce before adding, "You would not know what that's like." "It cannot be worse than what I have already experienced." "It is, Pearce, believe me. It is home to all manner of thievery and debauchery, a place where the dreams of the inexperienced meet head-on the misery of the failed. There are boys who have become men, creatures who will never pass for lieutenant, stuck in such places, bereft of any other place to go, too proud or incompetent to take a lesser rank." Pearce had a fleeting recollection of the mid's berth aboard Brilliant. "Yet they are always full." "Of course. It is a way for a boy with limited prospects to progress." "To wealth?" Pearce interrupted. "Just like every sailor I have ever encountered, ashore and afloat." Colborne ran a finger over one of the epaulettes, his voice taking on a mildly wistful tone. "When you are a nipper, Pearce, it is glory you dream of, not wealth. Of battles won and honours earned, of superiors amazed at your daring, even a levee at Windsor with the king ignoring admirals and generals, eager to hear of your exploits." "Something achieved, I imagine, by 1 in 1,000. "Less. But it is that which makes tolerable no privacy, certain tyranny for whoever is the new boy, and never enough food. I cannot ever recall my time there without my stomach rumbling." "Most people ashore have more cause to worry where their next meal is coming from. Just outside that door there are boys of the same age as your mids who will starve if they don't steal." "We do not live in a perfect world, I'll grant you. But I wonder, does culling the rich, as they are doing in France, make life any better?" Any reply Pearce might have given to that was stopped by the tailor emerging from his storeroom, several coats over his arm, that followed by the ritual of trying them on. The man, as befitted his trade, had a good eye, and if some of the garments were tight, they were close enough to a fit to be serviceable. The one Pearce would have chosen, almost new and of good quality, was discarded after a quick and silent shake of the head from Colborne. He nodded when Pearce tried on a worn coat, not by any means the worst, not quite shabby, but slightly too small, that cramped him under the arms. Next came the hats, rigid naval scrappers that sat fore and aft on Pearce's head. Again Colborne assented to one which was not perfect, a bit rat-nibbled around the rim, and Pearce, who liked to dress well, was obliged to defer to his choice. Next came the haggling over the price, pitched too high as a matter of course by the tailor, beaten down by both men until a stalemate was reached. "Of course, if you were to leave your old garment, I may be able to make some alteration to the price." That got a raised eyebrow from Pearce as the tailor continued, "It is of decent quality, and by the stitching has been run up by a very good craftsman." "It is also, of course, French." "You can tell?" The tailor shrugged in that open-handed gesture that was such a characteristic of his trade. "To a man in my occupation, the cloth and the cut, but more especially the stitching, is to you what a face would be. It tells me a great deal." Suddenly aware that he might be praising it too much, the tailor added, "Not that it has full value. A great deal of work in cleaning and repair will be needed to make it saleable." Pearce emerged under a hat and in his tight blue coat, the lighter by near 4 guineas, to be told that the garments had been chosen because it was best not to look too prosperous. "For half the shops round here will be after you before you get away from the port. Wouldn't take too long for men like that to smoke your true rank." The look Pearce gave him produced a small laugh before Colborne continued, "These men know their trade, and it is fair to say they know ours." "Yours," insisted Pearce.
And they're not just here around the ports. They could be anywhere, looking for a running sailor to turn in. Best to look poor.
Pearce suspected that was not the real reason. Colborne had diminished him in the eyes of the ship's crew. Dressing him like a near tramp was just another way to take him down a peg. The next purchase was a sextant, and like his coat and hat it had seen better days.
This is like a badge of office, Pearce. Anyone seeing this and the coat will know you are Navy, and elevated enough to be ignored.
As long as they don't ask me to use it. That purchase completed, Colborne took him to a large, bustling inn called the Angel, in what was the main street of the town, a wide, uphill thoroughfare of a kind that John Pearce had seen all over England. Tall, narrow dwellings above shops, red brick and grey stone, well-proportioned and redolent of the ordered society that had created them, with the odd medieval structure of timber-framed wattle and daub sitting incongruously in between. Civic pride and prosperity had seen the high street cobbled, with pavements of York stone for those on foot. The Angel was a fairly new construct, meant to look imposing, with large windows and gas lamps to light it at night. Chalked on a board outside the arched entrance to the stable-yard were the times and destinations of the various coaches that came and went from the town.
I leave it to you where you go. That is none of my concern.
Pearce put out a hand to be shaken, but Colborne, who had been reasonably friendly throughout the various transactions that had got them to this place, declined to take it. His response was, in fact, quite blunt and aloof.
I think not, Pearce. It would imply that we are equals, and that is not an estate I would want anyone observing us to suppose.
The message that John Pearce was going to ask him to pass on to Michael O'Hagan died on his lips, and he was forced to mouth the words, "Trust me," to the back of a man walking away from him without a backward glance, and without even the slightest hint that he wished him well. The journey across southern England, first to Winchester, then on to the London coach, was far from comfortable. It was not just to save money that Pearce elected to sit on the roof of both. It was also to avoid intimate conversation. The turnpike roads were reasonably smooth, and the conveyances well sprung, but it was a rocky ride nevertheless. Even inside, the noise of the iron-hooped wheels on the metalled road surface and the constant blast of the horn meant that any verbal exchange had to be carried on at a high pitch. Yet talk there would be, for taciturn silence would be frowned upon, social intercourse being the only thing that made such travel bearable, the kind that strangers always indulged in. A midshipman's uniform coat was a standing invitation to say which ship he served on, how long he had been in the Navy, what action, if any, he had seen, and to whom he was related or acquainted. Pearce fancied himself a manufacturer of tales, but a tissue of lies, which he was bound to impart, was a difficult thing to sustain for 2 whole days. Best to take an outside seat where, while the coach was in motion, an exchanged shout was the maximum level of talk, and that was usually about the thing that concerned those passengers most, the weather. For rain soaked them, the wind buffeted them, and the jostle for an inside seat, where bodies on the rim kept out some of the elements, was a game of musical chairs at every stop to change horses and allow the passengers to stretch their legs. He played the taciturn young fellow early on, one who kept away from his fellow passengers in the inns at which they took sustenance, so in the main Pearce was left alone with his thoughts. What life had he led to get him to this point, for it was a fact that it was not one of his choosing? Would things have been so very different if his mother had not died when he was young? Would his father have become such a peripatetic preacher of social change if he had had a stable family life to maintain? Perhaps he would, dragging along his wife as well as his child, for Adam Pearce was a driven man, who believed that, with one more push, the world of equality for all that he sought would come to pass. He was convinced of that in the same way that the religious saw a beckoning paradise, and his conviction was so deep it made it hard for anyone, least of all his son, to point to the flaws in his contentions. So they had traversed the length and breadth of Britain, with no discernible pattern to their travel, on foot when funds were scarce, in a comfortable carriage when Adam Pearce could find a well-heeled sponsor decent enough to be embarrassed by his prosperity, spreading his brand of gospel, often to willing ears, sometimes to hostile crowds. They called him the Edinburgh Ranter, but Adam Pearce did not rant at all. He often spoke so quietly that those listening had to strain to hear, his words far from bellicose. Neither in speech nor in the many pamphlets he published did he employ venom to challenge the existing state of affairs. He used wit and irony to debunk the present social order, in which a few had plenty while the rest lived in near starvation. He portrayed it as a farce being played out against the interests of the mass of people, who were fobbed off with the excuse that if things were as they were, that was the way God willed it. Adam Pearce was most vocally not a religious man, though if pushed he would agree that some kind of superior being must exist, for to imagine otherwise was to take too much of a leap into the unknown. But he subscribed to his old friend Davy Hume's contention that, just because there was a God, that did not make him either benign, competent, willing or able to intercede on behalf of humans seeking succor from the grind of everyday existence. Organized religion he hated, the church in all its guises, for the way it took money from the poor and superstitious to sustain priests, ministers, and vicars, though his true venom was reserved for the Pope and bishops. Landlords he castigated for the rents they charged, judges for their endemic hypocrisy, monarchs and their offspring for being no more than a superior form of thief, and politicians for being more concerned with lining their pockets and making better the lot of their fellow man. In his early years, like any son, John Pearce thought his father infallible. This made more potent by the fact that they spent almost every waking moment in each other's company, and though it was skewed by his own ideas, Adam Pearce made time every day, when schooling was impossible, to see to his education. On the rare occasions that they did stop for an extended time, usually a winter spent under a sympathetic roof, proper schooling would be arranged. That was never easy. The making of new friends and the identification of new enemies, usually a fight or two to establish that he was not feeble and could hold his own. That was coupled with the heaviest burden of all, having to take in the received wisdom of organized schooling that said there was an all-powerful God in heaven, a near-divine king on the throne, that England, Scotland, or Wales, wherever they happened to be, was a country singularly blessed by the Almighty, that the true task of the budding citizen of this world was to support the present order in all its glory, and to fight and kill the nation's enemies. In fact, the antithesis of everything his father had raised him to believe. The philosophy Adam Pearce propounded was not going to be challenged by a child too young to argue, nor did constant repetition of the same refrain produce boredom. He saw the world through his father's eyes, and it was not until his 14th year, after the publication of a particularly uncompromising pamphlet, and they had been taken up by the law and slung into the Bridewell prison, that John Pearce seriously began to question his father's philosophy. Locked in a barred chamber with near 100 other offenders, every one of whom was vocally innocent, John Pearce had seen life at its most raw, and applying his father's principles to that place, he had found them sadly lacking. He had never thought that the poor and dispossessed had natural dignity, but exposure to the lowest elements in the mass dispelled the notion that they had any at all. From the warders to the smallest urchin, most of those with whom they shared a prison qualified in every way for the sobriquet dregs of humanity. In fact, that was one commodity they did not have at all. Grossly ugly, slatternly females, who evinced no shame in public copulation, who saw soap and water as a danger to health, and who were wont to relieve themselves where they stood. The men and boys, who were no better, displaying ignorance in the mass, a stupidity backed up by the absolute certainty of the rightness of their obtuse opinions. For such people, the filthy straw on which they were obliged to sleep was what they lived with all their miserable lives. Few had any hope of release. In fact, John had soon learnt that freedom was not sought with much vigour. These were folk content to live in such squalor, because, damp, filthy, and stinking as it was marginally more secure than life outside. No person was safe from thieving fingers, and Providence was most unkind to those prisoners who were solitary souls from a decent background. At least Adam Pearce and his son, who had roughed it in their time, and had even been at risk of robbery before, could take turns sleeping, so that one was always on watch to keep what few possessions they had to themselves. Not that they kept them for long, since they had to be traded with the warders for small privileges in the article of food and the ability to keep clean, or for paper, wax, and quill to send out letters to friends and supporters. These asked for assistance to get them released, or moved to one of the more comfortable parts of the prison, on the floors above ground that did not flood with human waste when the rains fell heavy, where proper beds and privacy could be bought for a price, as could decent food fetched in from good local hostelries. There were few things John Pearce dreaded in life, but a return to that was one of them. He was sure, had the men who pursued him that night caught up with him after he had sought refuge in the Pelican, he might have killed them to avoid being incarcerated in such a place again. He left the coach at a leafy village called Ealing, and walked the rest of the way through open countryside into London, for to go all the way to Charing Cross was too dangerous. It was a place where sharp eyes were on the lookout for debtors, thieves, and anyone who had good reason to hide from the law. Inside his coat he had the letter Surgeon Lutyens had written, detailing the circumstances of the Pearce case, and his first stop was at the Lutheran church that was home to his father.
"I think my son has a notion of my influence with court that is more than the case, Mr. Pearce."
Pastor Lutyens, as he fingered the letter, looked like an older version of his son, with thin grey curly hair, once ginger, that failed to hide a pinkish scalp. He had an upturned nose, pale, almost childlike skin, and eyes that, especially when showing surprise, reminded John Pearce of a fish. His accent, guttural and Germanic, was pronounced, his speech imperfect, which explained the way Surgeon Lutyens spoke English. Clearly, but with a precision that made it sound as though it was not his native tongue. "He was most sure that you would help, sir."
"So shall I, Mr. Pearce, for apart from Charles Heinrich's request I speak, it is Christian duty to do so. All I say is, I see the king on few times, and I have been most strong advised not to trouble his majesty with little things. His health, as I show you know, is delicate."
"I was given to understand he was cured of his ailments."
"The problem lurks, Mr. Pearce, ready to come back to haunt. Everyone, his ministers and his servants and equerries, are at pains never to excite him, though what we witness from across the Channel, a king murdered, and his wife, children and family treated like the worst kind of felons, an even state of mind is hard to keep.
"The Queen?" Pearce asked, for the pastor, looking wistful, seemed about to launch into a discussion of the state of affairs in Paris.
"Comes to me more often, and I am many times called to Windsor to converse with her in native German, and listen to her concerns for her soul and those of family. Her sons and daughters give her great worries. Children can be sore trial."
Pearce coughed, to stop him wandering onto that subject too. The male royal princes were a debauched nuisance, living evidence of the soundness of his father's ideas on monarchy. The girls he knew nothing about, except that they were unmarried. "Will she be well disposed?"
"I talk with her. And as I often remind good lady what a Christian should do, there is some hope that she will see plea to her husband for clemency as duty, not favour, as my dear son implies.
Can I ask you what you think the chances are, sir?
How I say, I do not have strong rights to King's ear, and do not know how dangerous your father is seen in court circles, or you. Nor I a reader of such writers as he, but the King is a kind man, and listens to Queen. I think he might consent to raise warrant that threatens you and your father, for an assurance no further incitements will take place.
I doubt my father has health enough for that.
Then you must leave with me, young man.
I must ask for some form of time, sir, since the state of my father's health is most pressing. The pastor shrugged.
If your father believe in God, he would know such matters lay in his hands.
There was no time for theological discussion, so John Pearce just said, I must trust you to do what you can, and I assure you I am grateful.
How I contact you if I have any news?
I shall contact you, sir.
If you need a place to lay head, I will be happy to provide it.
That is most kind.
Then you could tell me how my fool son is faring at sea.
Seeing the look of curiosity on Pearce's face, he added,
Perhaps you not know his competence. It far exceeds the needs of navy, that a place where barbers pass for surgeons. Yet he chooses to throw all his prospects of an excellent position.
All I can tell you, sir, is that he seemed happy in his station.
Indulgence, Mr. Pearce. Selfish indulgence. I despair of boy.
The house he was watching was the same one from which he had so nearly been nabbed on his last visit to London, a narrow yellow brick residence which sat on the end of a terrace of three-storey abodes in Clerkenwell. It was home to John Horne Tooke, one of the men who had founded the London Corresponding Society, in reality a debating club, the first of many to spring up in the aftermath of the Revolution, a society specifically dedicated to effecting the kind of change that they saw taking place in France. 1789 and the fall of the Bastille seemed like another age, yet it had happened less than 4 years previously. Hard to recall now the joy with which that event had been greeted, and not only by those who felt the present system of government in Britain corrupt. Even members of the administration had greeted the upheaval in Paris as the overthrow of a tyranny, while writers and poets had poured forth a stream of prose and stanzas to celebrate the event. To Adam Pearce it was like a vindication of all he had argued for, though he was wise enough to see that part of the euphoria in the upper echelons of society was brought on by a sense of relief at the humbling of a long-time foe. They had been at war with France with few breaks since the time of Louis XIV, so a Briton could never think of that country without thinking of an enemy. In the last 100 years the list of conflicts was long: the War of the Spanish Succession, the Austrian Succession, Jenkins' Ear, the 9 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, the American War of Independence, those interspersed with alarms and excursions as some slight on either side, real or imagined, led to an expansion of the army and the fleet. Even in the periods of peace, the people of the British Isles felt threatened by the one nation left that could match her genius for trade. France was the great commercial rival to be fought in Bengal and the Carnatic, Canada, the West Indies, the South Seas, in Belgium, the Rhineland, and in any distant outpost where rivalry was endemic to plant the flag of possession. A country larger by far, more populous in the mass, who alone in the world could build a navy to match the wooden walls of England. France, a great Catholic nation, could threaten invasion. It was their support that had kept alive the notion of a Jacobite rebellion and the hope that some still harboured of a Stuart restoration. Prior to France, the great enemy had been Catholic Spain. She had been humbled by the defeat of the Armada, never again to threaten the British shore. The French Revolution was seen as a like event in the life of the country, the laying to rest of an anxiety that the collective imagination had lived with for several lifetimes. No great battle had been fought to bring about a hope of lasting peace. Instead, the steady drip of war had bankrupted the monarchical tyranny of France. Britain and her parliamentary system, rooted in her control of the king, and their Protestant faith, had triumphed. Adam Pearce was suddenly sought after, a man who had spent years preaching a message of equality, who was held to have a greater understanding of the forces unleashed by the events across the Channel, was much in demand. The hand-to-mouth existence his son had known all his life was gone. No more was he obliged to traverse the streets of some town or city crying out that all should attend to listen to his father, or to pass the hat round a gathering in some rural backwater, a weather eye kept out for the local youths who would certainly rob him of the few pennies and odd sixpence he collected if they could. At the same time, he had to take the temperature of the reception, for more than once he and his father had fled a likely spot with sod turfs flying past their ears. Meetings became publicised events rather than ad hoc gatherings, with agreed fees put up by men of means, eager to hear where this new world order would take them, for there was not a soul born who did not think that events in Paris and Versailles would impact in Britain. Change would come here too, reform that seemed long overdue to the mass of thinking people in the country. It was part anxiety and part hope that made those with much to gain or lose eager to hear what might come to pass. On top of that, it seemed every printer in the land wanted the ideas of Adam Pearce in a pamphlet, with money paid per word, and the Edinburgh ranter was only too happy to oblige, for carried along by the euphoria he too was sure that radical change was coming to sclerotic arteries of British life. It did not last, and it was not just what happened in Paris that altered the mood. True, the humbling of Louis and his queen evoked sympathy, just as the constant drumbeat of revolution gave alarm to those who believed in order. London was suddenly full of émigrés, and they too were looked on with pity, those who extended that to them seeming to quite forget that all their lives they had been part of a system that had trod on the necks of the poor to keep alive their privileges. Yet it was more the alarm of the established order, and those who supported it, that brought about change. King George, his family and court, worried that they would share the fate of Louis and the parasites of Versailles. What great landowner could look with anything other than a jaundiced eye at the reports of moves to break up the great French landed estates? The bishops saw that their silk-lined livings would disappear, just as they had for their Catholic counterparts in France. The commercial interests, the great trading monopolies, and the money brokers of the City of London knew that instability was inimical to profit, and the one salient fact emerging from France was that the box of revolution, once opened, was hard to close. The tide did not turn suddenly. It was gradual. Within a year, speeches damning the excesses of revolution, which would have been howled down 12 months before, were listened to in respectful silence. Clever men like Edmund Burke alluded to the disorder in France and contrasted it with the settled peace of England, and asked how any good could come of such mayhem. So the rich had been humbled, but had the labourer suddenly become their equal? Was such a thing desirable? Had France really changed? Was she no longer a rival to be feared? Was she not the same old enemy in another guise? Siren voices played on the fears of the nation. The curse of the papist religion, which Bourbon kings had determined to force down the throats of Protestant England, was replaced by the fear of no religion at all, for the men leading things across the Channel were godless creatures. In that changing climate, Adam Pearce had composed one pamphlet too many, and one too radical. As the French parliamentarians stripped their king of even more power, the Edinburgh ranter had called for similar measures here. There was nothing new in what he said. He had been saying it for years. But now his voice carried some weight, enough to instill alarm in those who feared his influence. The charge of sedition was invoked, a warrant issued for the arrest of Pearce, père et fils. One sojourn in the Bridewell was enough prison for any man, so they had fled first to Holland, then to Paris, where Adam Pearce, soulmate to the Revolution, had been welcomed with open arms. John Pearce shivered. For standing so long and thinking these thoughts, the chill had reached to his marrow. The smoke had been coming out of the house chimneys for a while now. The servants would be up and at their duties, lighting fires in cold rooms, heating water for their betters to wash, cleaning and polishing muddy footwear and feeding themselves a breakfast before seeing to the needs of their master and mistress. Several boys had called to deliver post, which indicated that Horn-Tooke was still active. The problem Pearce had was how to get to see him without being observed, for it was approaching that self-same door that had nearly seen him nabbed the day he had been forced to flee, ending up in the Pelican. There would be people watching the house now, as there had been then, men who knew the faces of those wanted by the law. It was another boy delivering a letter that gave him the idea, and reasonably familiar with the area in which he was walking, he quickly found a coffee-house on the edge of Smithfield Market in which to sit and compose a note, paper and quill provided by the owner. A penny postman was engaged to deliver the note, and Pearce, ensconced in a deep booth, sat on a cushioned bench, could think about food, and, hard by the London meat market, he could not deny himself a succulent beefsteak. Warmth seeped through his body as the food and the heat of the room drove out the chill. He would dearly have liked to sleep a little, for he had left Pastor Lutchen's manse well before dawn, but he dare not. Fortunately, the coffee, as well as the continuous babble of those using the coffee-house, helped to stave off that desire. There were papers to read, the latest edition of the Morning Post and the New Observer, and they had dispatches from France, telling of the latest moves in the National Assembly, plus a list of those newly proscribed by a revolution intent on eating its own.
"You will look in vain, young fellow, for news of your father."
The voice, deep and adult, was behind him, and Pearce felt a frisson of fear run through his body, which subsided quickly as he rationalized that anyone wanting to take him up would have just come and got him.
"I decline to sit with you for reasons that require little explanation."
Horn-Tooke.
"The same."
"You are watched."
"Every waking hour, and I fear even during the hours of sleep. I observed as I entered that you were reading a newspaper. Hold it up so that your face is covered."
"You will do the same?"
"No, young John. I have a better way. I talk to myself all the time when out of doors, in the street, sitting in a coffee-house or tavern, anywhere I think I can be observed. Sometimes I even wave my arms as if engaged in heated argument. Those who watch me think me touched by madness, I'm sure, but they do not seek another body just because my lips are moving."
"Do you have news?"
"It is not good news. Your father is in prison, put there, I am told, for his refusal to keep quiet about the activities of the Revolutionary Tribunal. He was denounced for an article he wrote in the National Assembly by a deputy called Fouché, a Jacobin. But he was not alone in the motion, nor was your father the only one proscribed that day, though Tom Paine is still at liberty."
"He has been more circumspect, no doubt." They had a lot in common, Paine and Adam Pearce, but they virulently disagreed about one thing. Paine saw the way the revolution was going as a necessary catharsis on the way to a better life for all. John's father, who had originally held the same view, now disagreed, and was vocal in his belief there was nothing more than the acts of unprincipled men lusting after power.
"Your note said you left him in poor health."
"Incarceration will not improve it."
"Turn the page of your newspaper," said Horn-Tooke before continuing. "He still has friends, I'm sure. Perhaps they have done something for him, a private room, food, and the like."
Pearce could have said that such things were of the past, that the prisons of Paris were now too full for private apartments and bought-in food. But it was the other dangers that concerned him most. "I was in Paris last September."
"Yes, a most deplorable event. It made life very difficult for those of us on this side of the Channel who seek to change things.
There was a temptation to say how much more difficult it had been for the victims of the September massacres, to put Horntuch's discomfort in perspective, but he decided that using irony would not at this stage be helpful. Hundreds had been killed, their bloody heads paraded through the streets on pikes, slaughtered by self-appointed tribunals who had set up drumhead courts in the prisons themselves. Few hauled before such arbitrary justice had managed to successfully plead innocence, or have someone with power intercede to save their life. Most had been brutally murdered out of hand by madmen lusting after the blood of the rich. Only it was not the rich they were killing. Certainly the odd aristocrat had been a victim, but the revolution had by that time lost any reason. Some of the victims had been at the tearing down of the Bastille, and things had continued, if not at the same pace, with the same result. A farce of a trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal, with condemnation a near certainty, that followed incarceration and the daily thought that the next tumbrel to the guillotine would be yours. "There must still be people he can appeal to," the younger man insisted, "those with the power to get him released."
Well, certainly such people exist. Danton, for one, might intercede. Right now he is powerful and getting more so. Marat, we know, once admired your father's writings, and he might be able to use the power of his paper to change minds.
That made Pearce wonder just how in touch Horntuch was. Danton had sanctioned the murderous storming of the Tuileries, and Marat, in his inflammatory writings, had encouraged the behaviour that led to it. He and Adam Pearce had fallen out months before, and he doubted relations with Danton were much better. Both seemed set on a path to ever more bloodshed, not less, and if they were going to intervene, they would have done so to quash the imprisonment. "What are the chances of avoiding arrest if he comes back to England?"
"Slim, John, very slim. He would be required to publicly recant, and that is something I doubt he would do."
Pearce thought of Pastor Lutyens' words, that old Adam would have to be silent. That would be hard enough to guarantee. To demand he deny his beliefs was to ask the impossible.
But here we could certainly see him imprisoned in comfort. The Society has funds for just such a purpose. We could get him a private chamber and pay for any medical assistance he may require.
If I could get him to Holland, then the Society could support him there. "You're sure you could carry this?" The voice dropped to a deeper tone, adding sincerity to what Horntuch said.
"Your father was a spiritual founder of the Corresponding Society, and he, along with Paine, was one of the leading lights whose beacon we followed. He is therefore a charge upon our conscience, and I assure you no voice would be raised to deny him what he needs. And we do have some influence in Paris. If you wish, I will raise the matter at the next meeting."
"No."
"But—"
"If you have men watching the outside of your house, you will also have some inside the Society who are not what they seem." Pearce could feel the resentment through the wood at his back as Horntuch swelled with indignation, and he spoke quickly to head it off, for he needed this man, and all like him. Besides that, having lived in Paris and talked with those men who were now running the country, he knew just how much influence the London Corresponding Society had in the councils of the Revolution. Precisely none. To men of action, who had toppled a king and removed his head, had torn apart the way a country was run and were struggling to put it together again, who were engaged in a war to the death with Austria and Prussia on the side of the forces of reaction, people who did nothing but talk were more derided than admired. Any intercession in that quarter from men derisively referred to as les bavardiers d'Angleterre might lead to his father being more tightly guarded than released. "I do not doubt your good offices, sir, nor those with whom you founded your movement, but it would be naive of us both to assume that the government had not taken steps to find out what you were about, if only to gather evidence against you."
"We are careful, young man, very careful."
John Pearce put as much sincerity into his reply as he could, not only because it was necessary, but because he meant it. "I do not doubt it, sir, but care is not always enough."
"Then what is to be done to aid him?"
"I must go to Paris and get him released."
"I trust you jest."
"No."
"Then I count you as mad."
"Please understand, sir, that I have lived in that city. I know it well. I cannot be certain that I still have friends there, but I'm sure there must still be some." What he said next was more to appease Horn-Tuke than any belief that the man mentioned would aid him. "I have met Georges Danton on more than one occasion, and I have some hope that he will remember me."
"And Marat? He is riding the crest of a wave right now, having been arraigned by the National Assembly. The mob love him."
"Which is why I do not. Who is this Fouché you mentioned?"
"An ex-seminarian, very nearly a priest. He is described as dry and humorless, but a fanatical Jacobin."
"Powerful?"
"Was not particularly so, but who knows how the sands shift in Paris."
That was said with gloomy resignation, and it evoked some sympathy. Men like Horn-Tuke were personally committed to change at some danger to themselves. What they would not countenance was violence to achieve their aims, convinced that such behaviour was un-English, foreign, French and Papist in inspiration, even if the perpetrators denounced the Holy Trinity. They were upright Protestant burghers who held in common with most of their countrymen that they lived under a vastly better system than those across the Channel had ever enjoyed, and had done so since the Great Revolution of 1688. They were patriotic at the same time as they sought to undermine the present way the country was governed, a paradox that made life very difficult indeed. "I will need help. Can I ask you for it?"
"Name it."
"My first task is to get to the coast, somewhere safe, and I will need funds. For alone I cannot use force to free my father, and if I cannot persuade someone in power to help, then I must resort to bribery."
"There is nowhere truly safe, but I suggest you head for Sandwich in Kent. There is a residual sympathy for Tom Paine there, for he lived in the town, and Conway, the local vicar of the Church of St. Peter's, is, I know, sympathetic to our aims."
"A radical clergyman?" exclaimed Pearce with a palpable degree of surprise. "That is unusual."
"He is singular, certainly, though wise enough to hide his light under a bushel, for there are not many of his more prosperous parishioners who would appreciate his sentiments. I have an address you can go to there, and Sandwich has boats in abundance and easy access to the sea, while the hand of the excise is, I am told, light."
Pearce had the feeling he might not be the first to use the suggested avenue of escape. Horn-Tuke and his friends had helped others evade the clutches of government men. Either that or a route had been set up with the leaders of the corresponding society in mind, arrest for them being a constant possibility. "I must reluctantly ask again. Funds?"
"That is one thing I am happy to say we are not short on. I will write to our friend in Sandwich and enclose a draft upon which you may draw up to 50 guineas.
"Will there be that much money in a small seaside port?"
"It is a smuggling town, John, and one of the things they smuggle most is gold. Our friend the vicar will provide you with the funds you need, and arrange your passage across the Channel. You will, I assure you, find him most resourceful."
This note might be intercepted. Horn-Tuke responded with an exasperated tone.
"Do give us some credit, young Pearce, for knowing what we are about. We have a private code which we use in our letters. Myself you will not see again, for to be observed once more in proximity to me might bring about that which you least desire."
"I might be followed."
"Aye. When it comes to the wherewithal to keep the lid on dissent, the government has a seemingly endless supply of men and money."
"Thank you, sir, and I hope one day I will be able to have my father say that to you face to face."
Tell me, young John, this navy garb you are wearing, how did that come about?
It is a long story, sir, too long for an occasion such as this.
Perhaps another time.
Providence willing.
Wait till I have been gone 10 minutes before you leave. I have penciled a note for you to take with you and set it inside a copy of the Gentleman's Magazine, which I will leave on my table. Goodbye, and good luck.
The wood between them creaked again as Horn-Took rose to leave. John Pearce folded his paper and slid out to take it back to the pile that sat on the central table, catching a quick sight of the man's broad back as he exited through the door, and heard him very volubly talking to himself. Quickly he grabbed the magazine and followed him, stopping just away from the window that stood to one side of the door. Over the rim of the Gentleman's Magazine he watched the scene unfold as two men in heavy coats and big hats which obscured their faces detached themselves to follow him. He thought about what he had said, that there would be at least one spy in the organization Horn-Took headed. He hoped the older man would hold his tongue about their meeting, but had to acknowledge that there was no point in him worrying about it, for it was beyond his control. He must get to the Kent coast, and as quickly as he could. That meant another long walk to the Old Kent Road, to an inn where the coaches going to south-east England made their first stop to change horses after Charing Cross. Rain began to fall as he walked, and he cursed it, for the short jacket he was wearing was not much to keep out the wet, and the prospect he faced of once more sitting on the top of a coach was most unwelcome. On this occasion it was more than ever necessary, for the road went by way of the River Medway, and that debouched onto the Nore anchorage, the place where he had first been taken aboard HMS Brilliant. He recalled the mass of shipping, including 100-gun ships of the line that filled the estuary. Thus there was a good chance that some of the coach passengers would have connections to the Navy. A haberdasher's shop at Blackfriars, close to the bridge across the Thames, was happy to sell him a cloak, disappointed, given the state of his other garments, that they could not oblige him with a whole new outfit. But his determination to bargain got him a scarf thrown in. The cry that there was a ship in the offing did nothing to stop the flogging of Devereux, the ship's bully. Ralph Barclay knew him of old, a man who harboured his grog for a true blowout. He had got drunk and had started to fight, or rather, since he was a huge man with big fists, to beat up his messmates. The fact that he had a broken jaw, not properly mended, did nothing to inhibit either the drinking or the fighting. So Devereux had to have his Monday dozen, and since he was not much loved by the rest of the crew, the boatswain's mate was laying to with a will. Devereux's back showed the scars of previous floggings, but no sound escaped from his mouth, though he bit hard on the leather strap placed there.
"Punishment complete, sir." "Cut him down, Mr. Sykes," he said to the boatswain before adding wearily, "Let that be a lesson to you, Devereux. It is my earnest wish never to see you seized up to the grating again."
"Fat chance," said Boatswain Sykes under his breath.
"Mr. Lutyens is all yours."
Devereux went below to the sick-bay, trailed by the surgeon, stiff in his gait, but without aid, determined to show all aboard that he could take his punishment as well as he took his drink. This while Henry Digby gave the orders that would get the deck cleaned up. Ralph Barclay took a telescope and trained it on the horizon. The vessel beating up towards the convoy was quickly identified as a warship, a frigate of much the same size as HMS Brilliant. Both Ralph Barclay and Davidge Gould were on the threatened side by the time she was hull up, staying in that station even when the pennant at the foremast head identified her as a British warship, under the command of a Vice-Admiral of the White Squadron. With the convoy sailing majestically on, Ralph Barclay ordered Firefly back to her station, awaiting the arrival of the vessel, which, going astern of him, came up smartly onto the wind and set a course to come alongside. The Voice, once they were sailing in parallel, speaking through the trumpet, boomed over the intervening water.
"Amethyst, Captain Blackstone at your service."
Ralph Barclay's first thought was that this Blackstone was his junior. He knew every name on the captain's list, and how they stood in relation to him, and it was comforting to know when he shouted out his ship and name that the other fellow would know that in a situation requiring a face-to-face meeting, it would be he who would be obliged to lower a boat.
"I have orders, sir, from Admiral Hotham, who is presently anchored at Lisbon." "I am under Admiralty orders, Captain Blackstone." "I am aware of that, sir, but Admiral Hotham has sent me out expressly to meet escorted southbound convoys and assure those in command of King's ships that between here and Gibraltar the seas are clear of any enemy vessels, and are being heavily patrolled by our Spanish allies. Given his shortage of frigates and sloops, the Admiral is somewhat blind to matters pertaining to the Mediterranean, where he is bound once his fleet is assembled. He therefore requests that you accede to his orders to leave your convoy and join him forthwith. Naturally, written orders will be made out to cover you from any censure."
Ralph Barclay knew he did not have to accede to such a request. He was within his rights to refuse. Against that, he and Davidge Gould would be joining that fleet as soon as he had delivered his convoy, and it would be a bad idea to start off in bad odour with Admiral William Hotham, the present commander, who would probably take it very amiss that what he had asked for had not been granted. That would be doubly true if the eventual head of affairs became Admiral Lord Hood, presently the senior naval lord on the Board of Admiralty, but certain, from what he had heard before he weighed, to take over the Mediterranean command. That was someone with whom Ralph Barclay already had a strained relationship. To be in the black books of both the proposed commanding officer and his deputy was madness.
"I am sure you understand the nature of the request, sir, and the service you would be doing the nation by agreeing."
Raising his speaking trumpet, Ralph Barclay replied,
"I am minded to agree, sir, but from your words am I to understand that you wish to strip the convoy of all of its escorts?"
"That is the Admiral's wish." It was damned uncomfortable having this shouted conversation, something everyone on both crowded decks could hear, for Ralph Barclay was forming a notion that would aid him in another way, namely the chance to detach himself from Davidge Gould and HMS Firefly. He could not be sure that the simultaneous examination of his and Gould's logs would not set off an inquest into his recent behaviour, but if he could stagger their joining, with Gould doing so after he had reached Gibraltar, that possibility would be diminished, if not actually killed off. And if Hotham wanted frigates and sloops in the Mediterranean, there was not much point in Gould raising the rock, then coming all the way back to Lisbon.
"Captain Blackstone, you may have observed that we took a prize on the way south, a French bark. I am loath to leave the convoy entirely unprotected, so I will order Captain Davidge Gould, who has HMS Firefly, to stay with her, and I will set a course with said prize for Lisbon, once I have given the requisite orders." "Admiral Hotham will be most grateful, sir, and may I wish you joy of your capture?" "You may, sir. You most certainly may."
Then Ralph Barclay turned to the master, Collins, and ordered him to work out a course for Lisbon.
"Mr. Digby, signal to both escort vessels to close with Brilliant, if you please."
Henry Digby was as happy as his captain, for what was being proposed offered the prospect of adventure. Convoying merchant vessels was dull, frustrating work, made doubly so by the cantankerous, nay, downright perverse behaviour of the people they were asked to protect, the merchant captains. "Lisbon," said Lutyens, who had been invited to take coffee in the captain's cabin by Emily Barclay. "I dare say we shall take some pleasure there." "Dry land will be a pleasure." "Amen to that." "And," Emily added, carefully pouring a second cup for the little surgeon to avoid spillage due to the swell, "it will do Lieutenant Roscoe no end of good to be ashore and still, will it not?" Lutyens smiled, for Emily was, he knew, teasing him. "I had not forgotten Mr. Roscoe, Mrs. Barclay, and you are right. And just so I am aware of what you are truly thinking, it will also do him good to be under the care of more competent medical practitioners." "I thought no such thing," protested Emily loudly.
"What?"
asked her husband, entering the cabin and removing his hat. "Mr. Lutyens was being unfair, husband." It was a very jovial Ralph Berkeley who responded.
"A flogging offence if you were involved, my dear."
"I merely alluded to the better care that Lieutenant Roscoe would receive in Lisbon, sir." "No, sir," said Emily, jabbing his arm in a coquettish way that betrayed her youth. "You did not, sir. You made a most cruel allusion that I thought you incompetent." "Then, in the face of such dire punishment, I must withdraw it unreservedly."
"Coffee?"
asked Ralph Berkeley, who followed that with an irritable look at Lutyens. The surgeon quite mistook it, not knowing that the captain was thinking that if he had removed one fly from the ointment of his career with the notion to detach Davidge Gould, then he still had one firmly stuck in his sick-bay. "It was a jest, Captain Berkeley."
"Of course,"
Berkeley replied, aware that he was frowning.
"Forgive me. I have many matters to consider."
Complex, thought Lutyens, looking at Berkeley's slightly puffy, broken-veined face, now relaxed and smiling as he took the small coffee-cup from his wife. His uniform coat gave him an air of command, but his fluctuating moods tended to diminish that. "Her I can read, for she is all innocence. But her husband, that is a man with many strands to his being. If they anchored at Lisbon, his workload would decrease. The wounded would be sent ashore, and for the rest, the crew would be too busy trying to catch the pox for him to worry about treating them. This would allow him time to collate the observations he had made so far on this voyage, and begin perhaps to draw some conclusions. Not enough to begin to write a paper, but pointers to which way his research should proceed. The title of the eventual dissertation he had already decided upon: An Inquiry into the Stresses of Life at Sea for the Seamen and Officers of His Majesty's Navy, and Certain Conclusions on the Mental Health thereof. Perhaps it should be officers and seamen. "Sorry?" inquired Emily. Lutyens had spoken, inadvertently, out loud, a trait that he would have to watch. It would never do to let on that he was researching the crew of HMS Brilliant. All in all, his decision to join this vessel was working out to his advantage. With no way of knowing if the crew were typical, he had nevertheless observed the application of discipline and its limitations, had not only watched as men went into a fight, but had dealt as a surgeon with the consequences. He had seen men pressed, and the way they reacted to that. Many of those who had come aboard at Sheerness now seemingly resigned to a life in the Navy, just as he had seen the strivings of the likes of John Pearce and his ilk to get off the ship. That last thought made him wonder where Pearce was now. Ashore, probably, and using to full advantage the letter he, Lutyens, had written to help him in his cause. That made him look at Emily Berkeley, because, although he could not be certain, he had felt that she had been fascinated in some measure by John Pearce. Perhaps for the reason that he was so different from the run of the fellows her husband had pressed from that Thameside tavern. He had a bearing about him that made him stand out, yet there was always the chance that it was more than that. He would never know, for to ask would only offend, but it had added to his study the effect of a captain having his wife aboard, and the difference that presence made to the way that same captain went about his duties. "So I escaped my flogging after all," joked Lutyens.
"For the moment, sir. I would not wish to deny myself the right for eternity."
"Surely you would never flog the surgeon, husband?" Ralph Berkeley laughed, for he knew, as did Lutyens, that he had no right to do so.
"You have my word, my dear, that he is safe."
Lutyens, thinking of the man whose back he had just treated, said, "You would not extend that to the rest of the crew?" It was a damned uncomfortable question to pose with his wife present, and Ralph Berkeley had to fight to stop himself from saying so. There was a fundamental disagreement between him and Emily about shipboard punishment, She was horrified by it. He knew the need of it. Lutyens must have realized that it was a maladroit question too, for he flushed slightly.
"I recall a little rhyme that covers my thinking on the matter, Mr. Lutyens. Tender-handed, stroke a nettle, and it stings you for your pains. Grasp it as a man of metal, and it soft as silk remains. 'Tis the same with common natures. Use them kindly, they rebel, but be rough as nutmeg graters, and the rogues will use you well."
"It is an interesting notion to see all men as plants."
"Believe me, sir,"
replied Ralph Barclay, looking at Lutyens, but really speaking to his wife,
"there are men aboard this vessel who would aspire to the sense innate in a plant and fail to achieve it. Now, let us move on to more congenial topics, like Lisbon."
They raised Cape de Roca just after dawn the following day, making a southing before coming up north-northeast to enter the mouth of the Tagus. Hotham had anchored his fleet opposite the city in the P.2 cove, half a dozen line-of-battle ships, including the 64-gun Agamemnon, and it gave Ralph Barclay some pleasure to know that Horatio Nelson, who commanded her, would have his eye on the bark in his wake, with the red ensign above the French tricolour denoting that she was a prize. He hoped and prayed that Nelson, along with all the other ship's captains, was deeply jealous. Almost immediately he secured his anchorage, the flagship made his number, and that required him to go aboard with his logs, his exit from the ship coinciding with that of the still comatose Lieutenant Roscoe, who was sent into a boat strapped to a piece of planking, lowered from a whip on the yard. There was a moment when Ralph Barclay stepped through the entry port of HMS Britannia, to be greeted by stamping marines and a flagship lieutenant with his hat raised, when he imagined himself coming aboard such a 100-gun vessel as its captain, and that was only a short step from the notion that one day he might be greeted as the commanding admiral. He was years away from such a rank, but this war might last and take a few of those ahead of him on the captain's list out of commission. Ralph Barclay felt no guilt at contemplating the death or serious injury of his peers. He assumed they thought likewise. Each and every one was fired by ambition for rank and wealth, not necessarily in that order. In truth, he was sure all of them would forego the former for the latter any day. Better to be rich than merely gilded. That he was kept waiting after such a peremptory summons to come aboard came as no surprise. Admirals like to keep captains waiting. It reinforced their sense of superiority. That he did not have to wait long, Ralph Barclay put down to his having taken a prize. Not that Hotham would make a penny out of it. Being under Admiralty orders, there was no flag officer grasping for an eighth share. Relieved by the Admiral's clerk of his books and papers, he was invited to sit opposite William Hotham, reprising as he did so what he knew of the man. Reasonably successful, Hotham was short, pink of face, and good-looking for his age, a sailor who had done quite well out of the American War. But that was only part of the reason he was here. The man had connections sufficient to make him hard to refuse, and since he was not utterly incompetent, he had been gifted what was a most important post, albeit that he would soon be superseded by Lord Hood. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, mainly grapes, and one of nuts, evidence that one thing he had heard was true, that the man cared much for his belly. "I see a pretty little ship in your wake, Captain Barclay." Hotham sat forward slowly, selected a grape with great care, then sat back and put it in his mouth. "Am I to assume you have enjoyed some good fortune?" This was said with studied indifference, as though it was of no account whatsoever. Hotham was near to lounging in his chair as he added an apathetic stare to the question, which made Ralph Barclay think that he did not like him. Mind, Hotham was not alone in that. Ralph Barclay had little time for admirals as a breed. The only one he would speak of with deep respect had been his patron, Lord Rodney, and he was dead. "Yes, sir. We took her off Finisterre, she being out of La Rochelle. Her present name is Chantenay." "I dare say you wish me to buy her in." "Captain Blackstone did say you were somewhat short on vessels for long-range reconnaissance."
And, you blackguard, he was thinking, if you were due an eighth of the value, you would not hesitate. I would suggest that being completely sound, we took her without a shot being fired. She would be ideal.
Now it was the turn of the other bowl, and time was taken to crack a walnut.
I will think upon it.
Ralph Barclay knew he had an ace up his sleeve, and he played it straight away.
I have, regretfully, sir, to report some losses, particularly of officers.
The eyebrows rose slowly. Without a shot being fired?
This was a different affair, sir. After an engagement with another French privateer, this time off the coast of Brittany, I lost my second lieutenant, though the Premier is still alive, albeit at death's door.
Explain, Hotham said abruptly, sitting forward, his chewing stopped. He stayed in that listening position as the tale was recounted, the filleted version that put Ralph Barclay in a good light.
My losses in crew I have made up from the capture of that bark, though I would be obliged if I could distribute them through the fleet in exchange for other seamen, since I take no comfort sailing with so many Frenchmen aboard.
Hotham nodded, and Ralph Barclay knew he would sail on with a full complement made up in the main of proper British tars. He then added, his eyes firmly fixed on the Admiral's ruddy and handsome face,
"But in the article of officers, sir, I am, of course, at your disposal for advice."
Hotham did not beam. He was too experienced to react, but his visitor knew he would be damned pleased. Of the 8 lieutenants aboard Britannia, a high proportion would be there because of some connection to him, for William Hotham was the surest route to promotion. Lieutenants on flagships nearly always got first pick of anything going. Then there were captains in some of the anchored ships who had a claim on Hotham's good offices, and they would have what they saw as lieutenants deserving of promotion. An admiral gained prestige from his ability to advance his followers and their dependents, not just commissioned officers, but those holding warrants as well. So early in a war, the twin creators of opportunity, sickness and death in battle, had yet to take effect, so by offering him the chance to fill Brilliant's vacancies, Ralph Barclay was gifting the Admiral a real favour.
"Who have you put into the prize?" "Oh, the Premier of my fellow escort, HMS Firefly. She is commanded by Lieutenant Davidge Gould."
Giving Gould his true naval rank sent a message to Hotham, who hardly needed it. Gould, being only a master and commander, not a post-captain, could safely be ignored in whatever calculations were being made in Hotham's mind.
"That vessel, too, is mainly crewed by Frenchmen, though I hope a redistribution will take place at the Rock."
"We will see to that, Captain Barclay, if it is not so. Too high a proportion of Frenchmen on any vessel is hardly conducive to fighting efficiency. And who knows, some of them may elect to be taken to a prison hulk rather than serve with us." Hotham popped a quick grape, then added, "Do you wish me to give you a list of available candidates for promotion?"
"I doubt I know them, sir, while you do, or at least the captains who serve under you do."
"And you have got 3 plums to give out," Ralph Barclay was thinking, "which will ripple right through the fleet and do you no harm whatever. Quite a bit of good fortune before Hood arrives.
I am therefore willing to be advised."
The nuances of what Ralph Barclay was saying were clear to Hotham, he was sure of that. If he knew anything about Brilliant's captain, he would know how much his career had suffered by his attachment to Rodney. Not only was the late Admiral dead, but he had caused many a scandal when alive, not a problem to the likes of Ralph Barclay, who saw it only as the flawed side of genius, but meat and drink to those who loathed everything Rodney did and stood for, one of those being Lord Hood, who was close to being implacable about Barclay's old mentor. Given the serious disagreement he and Hood had had before HMS Brilliant weighed from the Nore, first over the appointment of the frigate's officers, and then in regard to Manning, with him coming out to command, Ralph Barclay was in need of some protection from Hood's ill will. Hotham nailed the point, though the face, including his deep brown eyes, was a study in forced blandness. "I seem to recall you served with Rodney."
"I did, sir. I owe to him my rise within the service. He arranged my examination for lieutenant, and it was on station in the Caribbean that he exercised his right as a commanding admiral to raise me to post rank."
"You were with him at the Sant?"
"In a frigate, sir, not in the line of battle."
Ralph Barclay had a vision, then, of the channel between Guadeloupe and Martinique, and the Isle de Sant which had given that encounter its name. The hot Caribbean sun, the sparkling sea, the din and smoke as the great ships clashed, the sudden shift in the wind that had given George Rodney his opportunity, which meant that when it was all over he had smashed the enemy, taken 5 French line-of-battle ships, and Ralph Barclay and the other frigate captains were picking dead Frenchmen out of the warm sea, not their own countrymen.
"It was a fine victory. The nation owes the late Admiral a debt of gratitude."
"Naturally, I agree, sir." Hotham sat bolt upright.
"I shall recommend some officers to you. Please, if you object to any one of them, say so."
"That is handsome of you, sir." Hotham nodded at what was a rather obsequious remark.
"My only question is this. Do you wish to retain whoever it is who is acting as your premier? For that will have some bearing on my choice."
"Lieutenant Digby is too junior to retain the position, sir."
"But?"
Hotham asked, because Ralph Barclay was frowning in a way that implied that this presented a difficulty. It did, for Digby deserved something, having carried out his duties with efficiency. He was too junior to be made up to first lieutenant, but Ralph Barclay could imagine that his wife would be far from pleased if he got nothing. They were friendly, too damned friendly, but quite apart from that, Digby had been witness to the events off the Brittany coast, as well as those to do with that pest John Pearce. Left in place, he could prejudice the men Hotham promoted against their captain. The fact that Digby, like Roscoe, had been foisted on him by Samuel Hood clinched his resolve to be rid of him.
"Might I suggest, sir, that his lot would be improved enough by a place on the flagship?"
Hotham rubbed his chin then, the slightly bulbous brown eyes looking away, his hand toying with another walnut. It was an easy request to grant. Britannia's captain would be a fool to disagree, but convention demanded he made it look like a difficult one. Finally he nodded.
"So be it. You will have a new suite of lieutenants, Captain Barclay. I will arrange for you to meet them this afternoon when you come to dinner."
"One more thing, sir. I have my wife with me."
"A little more female company will brighten up my cabin, Captain Barclay." Sensing the curiosity, he added, "There are other ladies coming, so by all means fetch your wife along. Who knows, we might name that bark you brought in after her."
That finished the bargain, as Ralph Barclay knew it would. Hotham was going to buy in the prize and gift it to someone else he wished to advance, yet another officer who would know to whom he owed his good fortune, and one who would in times to come act accordingly. But most important of all, he had signalled, without actually having to say the words, that Ralph Barclay no longer lacked for influence. He had been, if the word was not inappropriate, adopted. In time Hotham would repay the debt he owed, and work hard to promote the officer before him into a bigger and better ship. Emily Barclay had no need to be nervous, but she was, as her husband's cutter took them to the flagship. Again he was piped aboard, saluted by a file of marines coming smartly to present arms, she receiving a very deep bow from the receiving lieutenant. Nelson's boat came alongside before they departed, so introductions were in order.
"Captain Horatio Nelson, my dear."
"Mrs. Barclay," Nelson said, startlingly blue eyes wide, before bending over her proffered hand. "I last saw you dancing in Sheerness." Yes, Emily thought, looking down at the top of the bared head, and the thick, rather untidily tied blonde hair. "You sneaked on me to my husband, telling him what a good time I had, and implying, no doubt, that I was being flighty." Nelson stood to receive what was a cold stare. Her husband, standing to one side, unable to keep the amused smile off his face at the confusion the glare caused. He was not fond of Nelson for many reasons. Though not far ahead of him on the captain's list, he had a ship of the line, not, like him, a frigate. His connections were sound, and included Barclay's bête noire, Sam Hood. Then there was the sloppy way he ran his ships, the fact that he could not hold his drink, but most of all for the way that the pint-sized little sod always behaved to him as though they were friends, which was the exact opposite of the true state of their relationship. Mind, he did that with everyone, and Ralph Barclay was sure he was cordially disliked because of it. "I think we should go on up, my dear. We must not keep the Admiral waiting." They left Nelson standing, which was a snub, for the proper thing to do would have been to insist that they ascend the companionway together. Seemingly feeling rather foolish, Nelson followed in their wake. "He looks too small to be a naval captain, husband," Emily whispered. "Indeed, he is more like a boy than a man." Her husband replied in kind. "I think I said to you before, my dear, that he is best avoided. The man is a bore who is convinced he is a genius. He also holds some absurd notion that he is attractive to the fairer sex." "If you count me amongst them, husband, let me assure you he is not." Ralph Barclay was not really listening. He was looking instead at Hotham, who had straightened himself to gain a good inch at the sight of Emily, and there was a flash in the man's eye that spoke volumes. "I think I can safely say the Admiral grants you that station, my dear." Hotham came forward to greet Emily warmly, immediately insisting that he was going to place her at his right hand. This occasioned a bit of shifting of the place cards, for it had not been planned until the Admiral saw that she was a beauty, not some broad-faced, horse-hipped harridan. Those shifted a place away from Hotham, the consort of the ambassador, and several ladies, wives, sisters, and daughters connected to the British merchants who lived in Lisbon, tried hard not to let anyone know they had noticed, or were in any way put out by this, but there was much sharp flicking of fans and glares aimed in Emily's direction. Ralph Barclay, who declined to change his own place, was content. Such people meant nothing. Let the Admiral drool over his wife, for it was another part of the cement that would adhere him to Hotham. The lieutenants were introduced, three rather stiff young men called Glaister, Bourne, and Mitcham, who would be seated well below the salt. Their new captain bid them come aboard the following day, making a mental note to send Digby in the other direction before they arrived. Then it was time to be seated, to partake of a meal that underlined the Admiral's love of good food, and allowed Ralph Barclay to acquaint himself with some of the officers and personages who would be part of the same fleet as he. Whoever had arranged the menu had clearly given some thought to local dishes. They had freshly caught sardines grilled over open coals, beefsteaks baked in wine with bacon and capsicums, then soused with vinegar so that they sizzled when served, while the main fish dish had been wrapped in vine leaves and came with a strong sauce of anchovies. The wine was from the north of the country, heavy and much stronger than claret, which had several officers drunk well before the cloth was drawn, the ladies departed, and the port and brandy decanters were set out. Nelson particularly was affected, growing more garrulous and noisy with each bumper he consumed, but he had always had a light head, and it was not helped by the heat of the crowded cabin. Ralph Barclay himself took the temperature of the other naval guests. Word would have got around the fleet about the promotions Hotham was arranging, and men as experienced as he would have drawn certain conclusions, one being that the captain of HMS Brilliant might be a man to cultivate, for he clearly had the ear of the commanding officer, and if he did not, they only had to look to the centre of the top table to see that his pretty young wife had the Admiral's undisguised admiration. "I like your Admiral, Captain Barclay," Emily opined as they waited for their boat to come alongside, "not least for the praise he heaped upon you. I could not dislike any man who calls you in such a fulsome way a gallant officer."
"Perhaps he will consent to dine with us before he orders me away."
"Do admirals eat in lowly frigates, husband?"
They do when they are to be hosted by someone as beautiful as you, my dear."
Emily, who had her husband's arm, squeezed it. He was not often given to that kind of flattery, being too stiff in himself for raillery, and it was true that the one he had just uttered was due to the fact that he had drunk quite copiously, but it was welcome nevertheless. She too, though nowhere near inebriated, had a warm glow from the wines she had consumed. Let others doubt the wisdom of her marrying a man so many years her senior, and yes, there had been an element of family duty in it, but she was determined to make it work, and that was so much easier when husband Ralph was in such a benign mood. What was it Nelson said that so upset everybody, by the way?
You saw he was drunk.
I could hardly fail to, since his voice went up with every glass, but I did not hear what he said that had everyone close to him looking away in embarrassment.
He said, in reference to the marriage vows, my dear, that every man is a bachelor east of Gibraltar.
How crass!
Quite.
If you do invite the Admiral to dine, don't invite him.
I wouldn't dream of it, my dear.
Henry Digby watched the departure of HMS Brilliant with mixed feelings, unsure whether his new station was a promotion or just a sideways move. Life as an 8th lieutenant aboard a 100-gun flagship had its compensations: space in the wardroom, decent food, and the knowledge that as those above him were promoted into other ships, he too would eventually be shifted out to another vessel. But it had many drawbacks in the sheer numbers aboard, over 800 souls of a lower rank than him, so that the intimacy of small ship life, where you would get to know everyone by name, was lost. Such service was at some stage necessary. He could not expect to spend his life in frigates, but it was the prospect of immediate battle he would miss. Ships of the line fought vessels of the same size in fleet actions, and they were rare events indeed. After only 4 days to revictual and make good his supplies of wood and water, Ralph Barclay was glad to be away. Lisbon was too tempting a place for a crew with a bit of prize money in the offing. To his new officers, who seemed addicted, once the duties of the day were completed, to the whorehouse, but most especially to his wife, who could not help but see a bargain in every tiny emporium: lace, furniture, cloth for clothing and drapes, copperwares, functional if not decorative porcelain, in fact everything that in England cost 5 times more, so that below decks there were dozens of filled crates lined with straw. What was doubly galling was that his frowns of clear disapproval at such expenditure had no discernible effect, which made him wonder what had happened to the creature he had known in England, before and after their nuptials, who had meekly fallen in with whatever he wanted, whether he stated it or not. There were positives. His crew now had a decent balance between British and foreign hands, and he had his full complement in all respects, most notably in the article of proper seamen. Emily had charmed Hotham and most of the senior fleet officers, made manifest by the renaming of the captured Chantonnet as HMS Frome after the Barclays' hometown, while the way he himself had made clear an attachment to the Admiral had got him what he wanted most, the dream of every captain, an independent cruise. He had also made contact with several dealers in specie, and should he be fortunate enough to touch at Lisbon homeward bound, he had been assured that he could count on a cargo of gold and silver to take home with him. Like taking his wife to sea, it was forbidden for the captain of a king's ship to carry private ventures, but the latter was ignored more comprehensively than the former. Gold and silver came into the Iberian Peninsula from the southern Americas, but only realized its true value when shipped to the capital markets of the north, the greatest of which was London. The dealers liked their bullion to be carried in heavily armed vessels, preferably swift sailors, and were happy to pay a 1.5% fee for carriage of the cargo. Naturally, when these could run into $250,000 in value, naval officers queued up to oblige. The number of homebound warships forced to stop at Lisbon for essential repairs might be scandalous, but it was one that was generally treated with a blind eye. Having cleared the mouth of the Tagus, Ralph Barclay set a course for Cadiz to drop off a dispatch for the officer liaising with Hotham's Spanish allies, and attempt to coordinate the entry of both fleets into the Mediterranean. He would be there long before them, with a ship in good order, a full complement of officers and crew, the comfort of his wife, and opportunity begging. He was a happy man. John Pearce was far from happy. The weather in the northern part of the English Channel was bad, and it had taken a heavy bribe just to get a local fishing smack to put to sea, a far cry from that which the professional smugglers used in these parts. They employed lightly built 24-oared galleys, the best of which, he had been assured, could make the 25-mile crossing on the right tide, a calm sea and with a following wind, in close to 2 hours. This was nothing like that. He was on a boat that was really built for inshore fishing, one which made the Griffin seem stable, so they were heaving around in the dark, with their passenger locked below, and having no idea if they were making any headway. This, while he cursed himself for his impatience in not waiting for the weather to moderate. All he was aware of, as he tightened his scarf and wrapped himself in his new cloak, was the stink of long-dead fish which permeated the wood of the hull, and the constant motion that had no rhythm to it. To top it all, he had been seasick for the first couple of hours, something he had not experienced before, and that made him silently promise never to make jokes at the expense of those afflicted in future, for it was a damned uncomfortable sensation. He also knew that the boast the master of this tub had made was likely to be just that. He was no real smuggler, only an occasional opportunistic one, and it had been Pearce's money that had persuaded him to put to sea at a time when getting a decent catch from fishing, with the weather foul and likely to remain so, was difficult. The Reverend John Conway, who had arranged matters, had turned out to be a most surprising cleric. He was not only a radical thinker, but had demonstrated a fine talent for forgery. He had produced for his guest a set of papers that looked truly official, a large and very convincing tricolor cockade, as well as the means to pay for both his passage and what difficulties he would meet once across. In the process of trying to get him a boat, the divine had introduced him to some of the men who lived off the contraband trade, hard, gimlet-eyed and reserved fellows who said little, except to politely refuse a request to carry him to France, whatever the proffered fee. Right at this moment, Pearce would have offered a king's ransom for a calm sea state and the right crew and vessel. "First hint of dawn, his honest friend," said a voice from a raised hatch above his head. "Happen we'll get a sight of the coast." Pearce bit back the temptation to say, "Yes, but which one?" "Hope there's no revenue men around, 'cause they's bound to wonder what we's doing out there in this weather." That was a hazard not previously mentioned, and it got Pearce to his feet. Damn the spray that would soak him, cloak and all. If there was any danger, he wanted to see it for himself. He also wanted to know if they could get away from it. Quickly he tied his scarf round his hat to keep it on his head, and climbed up through the hatch. The northeast wind bit into him as he emerged, so icy cold he could easily believe it came all the way from Russia, whipping up short, vicious waves that drove under the keel of the fishing smack and lifted it with ease. But that wind had one advantage. It meant clear skies, so that there was some visibility from a three-quarter moon, and dawn came with speed, turning the inky sky blue, so that any danger that threatened would be seen at a distance. Soon, chilled to the marrow, he looked around him at a deck no more than 10 feet in length, with nets rolled at the side to slow the water that ran through the scuppers. There was a single mast, well forward, with gaff boom running aft to make the triangle of the mainsail, and a bowsprit for a small jib. The scraps of canvas were well clewed up, and 4 men, the whole crew, were on the tiller, while another stood, arm wrapped round a stay, in the prow, hand over eyes, searching the horizon. Every one of them had been up all night, for he had occupied the crew quarters alone. Yet he had no sympathy. For the money Conway was paying, they could go without sleep for days. As the sun rose in the east, Pearce went to join the fellow for'ard, realized it was the master, and yelled in his ear, "What chance a revenue cutter?" He felt the man's warm breath on his ear as he got his reply. "A fair one, 'cause if my reckoning be correct, we is going on the route to Gravelines, and that be the main smuggling port on the coast." There was a temptation to say that he was aware of the name, as a way of letting this man know he was no stranger to such matters, but he decided the effort was too great, and besides, the less this fellow knew of him, the less he could blab to others. Pearce stood for a good 20 minutes, watching the sun first edge the earth's surface and slowly tear itself clear, changing from a fiery red to gold as it did so, and all the while the master kept his vigil. That he did so was a worry, and his next question was put to ease his concern. "Will they bother to demand we heave to?" "Never met a nosy bugger of a revenue man that wouldn't." "Then let's hope—" His passenger never finished the sentence, for the fisherman's arm shot out to a point to larboard of the small prow and yelled, "Sail!" Before Pearce could respond, the man was gone, hurrying down the pitching deck to the wheel, where he could be seen jabbing his hand. That had 2 men on the ropes that worked the single mainsail, raising it to expose a bit more canvas, while the captain joined the others to push the tiller round onto a more southerly course. The boom immediately adjusted and sheeted home for the new course. Looking to where the man had pointed, he saw for himself, as both the smack and the other vessel rose on their respective waves, the point of a cream-coloured sail. There was no way of knowing what it was, and even he, who still considered himself a lubber, knew they were on one of the main trade routes of the North Sea, for the Royal Navy depended on the northern states of the Baltic for half the things needed to keep their ships at sea. The Hansa ports of the North German shore constituted one of the great seaborne cartels in the world, and Russia, Sweden, and Denmark likewise traded on this route, which carried hundreds of ships a week, so the chances of the sighted sail being a threat seemed to him remote. That it did not to the fisherman was obvious. Whatever course and sail plan he had decided on was now in place, for the master came forward again to shout into his ear, asking him to come below. Back in the cramped and stinking crew quarters, so small they were almost nose to nose, they could at least speak. The master hauled off his foul-weather hat to reveal a ruddy, gnarled, ugly face, and as he spoke, a mouth without a single tooth. "We're going to try and make the beaches off Dunkirk. It's not what I had in mind to drop you off, 'cause you'll have a right old tramp to find a road, and if there be any patrols out, they's bound to haul you in." "With respect, is this not a little premature?" "How so?" "You have yet to positively identify the ship you see as a threat. It could be a merchant vessel, or even another fishing smack." The jaw rammed shut, the lower lip in such a toothless mouth nearly touching the master's nose, and his eyes left Pearce in no doubt that he had been tactless. "Allow that I can see a topsail for what it is, sir. Now, it might be a Hollander warship, or even one of our own, but whoever heard of a merchant captain having his high poles rigged at dawn? No, sir, never in life. They is set up for a chase if they sights out, and I take leave to suggest that if I can see them from my deck, then with lookouts aloft they'll have no trouble at all in seeing us with the sun full on our own canvas." "Do we need to run? Even if they are revenue and they come aboard, there's nothing to find." "There's you, sir, and I ain't asked you, 'cause it's no part of our bargain, what you are about that needs such a fee to get over the water." "I could disguise myself as one of your crew." The empty mouth opened in an exaggerated burst of laughter. "What do you take revenue men for, fools? They know the measure of my boat and all the others, and they know the crew numbers, if not every face. You wouldn't pass for a fisherman in a month of Sundays, for all you have a bit of tar in your palms, even if we could clothe you in summat right. Now you tell me it makes no odds if you're taken back to Sandwich, and I'll order course to close with the buggers. But I take leave to doubt that a man so secret about his travel wants that to happen." "Can we outrun them?" The master nodded, for the question answered his own.
Depends on our true position, sir, and that is more reckoning than certainty. But I was hoping to spy a line of dunes as soon as the sun rose enough to light them, so we best get back on deck and see if I's right.
Both emerged and looked east, peering harder as the smack lifted on the swell. The master grabbed hold of one of the hoops that ran up the back of his mast and began to climb, this while Pearce looked at the threat to the north and saw that it was much closer. Not just the highest sails now, but the mainsails below them were visible on the rise. Halfway up his mast, the master stopped and pointed again, his voice carrying to Pearce in spite of the wind.
"Just as I had it!"
Then he looked at the sail to the north, before clambering down to put his warm and smelly breath into Pearce's ear.
"It'll be too close a thing to set you ashore without your feet getting wet. We don't draw much water under our keel, so I'll take us in as close as I dare. Thank Christ the wind is off the land and the tide is falling, for I'd never got you beached if it were a lee shore."
"How close in can you get?"
"I doubt you'll have to hang on to your hat, but I don't think you'll get much comfort from your breeches till you find a fire."
It was an unpleasant thought. Wet breeches, a freezing wind, and sand. But the alternative was worse, for he would have great difficulty in explaining himself to anyone from the revenue. Indeed, with the clothes he was wearing under his cloak, midshipman blue, he might be taken for a spy. For certain he would be taken back to his home shore, there to be questioned, and Pearce doubted if whatever tale he came up with would stand up to much scrutiny. He felt lonely then, and wished that his fellow pelicans, particularly Michael O'Hagan, were around to share his plight. Michael would be as stalwart as always, even useless Rufus would be someone to talk to, and Charlie, when it came to escaping the clutches of the law, had more experience than he. Whatever, he could talk with them, and give some clarity to what was, at this moment, a whirl of confused thoughts in his mind. The master had gone to a locker by the wheel, and he came back with a battered box that contained a pistol, a powder horn, and a small bag of lead balls.
"You know how to load this?"
Pearce nodded, so the man continued.
"Then you's got to keep it dry and fire off a shot at us once you's on land, and it would be right handy if they was close enough to see the powder from the muzzle. Then I can say you came aboard by surprise-like and forced us to take you to France. It was that or a ball in the guts."
It was thin, very thin, and the next words the master used underlined that.
"They has to prove we's liars, for we'll all stick to the same tale, and you being armed and taking us unawares, we's not likely to know your name. I'll have to say you was in naval garb, that you knew more'n enough to tell us how to sail our boat, and that it was you who set the course. My guess is they will not believe a word of it, but they'll let us go after a bit of chest-poking."
The ship closing with them was hull up now, and as Pearce, back to the wind, prepared the pistol for firing, the master confirmed it was a revenue cutter crewed by customs officers who would be afire to take them, for they had a lean time against the men who plied the contraband trade. Those who traded illegally across the channel knew the waters like the back of their hands, which way the tides ran, and the effect of every fluke of wind, and if they were in a galley, unless the sea was rough, they could show them a clean pair of heels any time. Added to that, nearly every citizen on both shores was an enemy to them, either selling smuggled goods or trading them to England. There was scarce a house on the East Kent or Essex shore that did not have a hiding-place for contraband, and there was not a soul would spit on his neighbour to say what was hidden there. Even the quality were in on the trade, often financing the cargoes, and no faith could be placed in the local magistrates. They were more likely to aid their fellows than some busybody that threatened to bankrupt them. Try as the revenue men might, they rarely found smuggled goods, and it was a red-letter day if they made a capture. The wind had dropped slightly, the rising dunes that were now in plain view taking just the edge off it. The beach ran north and south for miles, and Pearce, once he had confirmed his intention to head inland, questioned the master about what lay beyond.
"There's a highway that runs up the coast not too far in, but my advice would be to get across that and use the fields to get to the outskirts of Calais, 'cause it's a military road. and is bound to have patrols and barriers manned by them newfangled National Guards. Beyond that, I dunno."
Pearce declined to tell him that he did, for he had come to this part of the coast on his way to England less than 2 months before. He would miss out Calais and head inland for a coach stop at the little village of Ardres, a place that was less likely to be under observation than the main port for cross-channel traffic. The shore was close now, the waves breaking across the beach and carrying them south. The master did not seem too worried about this, more concerned to keep his rudder and sails in a position that would prevent the smack from grounding. His last words to Pearce were simply that he could not do more than back his sail to take the way off the boat, and that only for a moment. Then he must get away and tack towards the revenue cutter, to underline the tale that they had all been taken under coercion. Pearce had removed his boots, and the captain, having put the now loaded but cocked pistol in one, with a tiny wad of tow between flint and cap, and the powder horn and spare lead balls in the other, tied them round Pearce's neck.
"Roll up your cloak and wrap it round your shoulders, for it will fail you in the water left loose."
"My ditty bag?"
"Put your hat in it, and toss that ashore is the best way."
"Thank you," Pearce said, and the look he added told the master that it was for more than the given advice. "I have not even asked your name." There was just a hint of embarrassment in the reply.
"Nor should you, for I never had a hankering to know yours. As for the passage and the revenue, friend, we can't have anyone saying that Sandwich Town fisher folk don't abide by a paid bargain. That would never do. Now get yourself set, chuck your dunnage, and jump when I say. And may God speed you to wherever it is you're in such a hell-fire hurry to get to."
The single sail flapped as it was hauled round, the rudder put hard over to bring the smack up into the wind. Then it was a hard tap that told John Pearce it was time. The bag, weighed down by the sextant, flew through the air, and he followed, jumping over the side into the icy water that came right up to his lower chest, which made him gasp. At first, being in the lee of the smack meant he was under no pressure, but the sail was reset quickly and they were heading offshore, which exposed him to the waves. It was a blessing that they pushed him shoreward, but he could feel the undertow that tried to drag his lower half back out again. He came ashore in a series of jumps more than a walk, and made it to the flat, sandy beach. Letting go of his cloak, he turned to look at his saviour, now clawing off with ease, driven by the wind that jagged at Pearce's back. The revenue cutter was in clear view now, the forepeak crowded with men as it raced towards the shore, all sails set. Pearce, not rushing, pulled out his hat and Conway's cockade, which he fixed to the brim. That on his head, he took out the pistol, and after carefully removing the tow, while keeping a strong thumb on the hammer, aimed it out to sea and fired. That it was a wasted shot in terms of a threat was obvious. A musket ball would have done no harm to either vessel, let alone a pistol. But there was a satisfying crack and a belch of visible smoke, which was what was required. He just hoped that it would suffice. With that he put the pistol in his waistband, picked up his boots, and turning, headed inland, trying to get himself to think in French, so that if challenged by anyone, he would reply in that language. It was easy, trudging across fields on the flat and barren landscape between Calais and Ardres, with what houses existed visible for a mile or more, to forget the upheavals that had gripped France in the last 4 years, turmoil that would eventually affect even the most isolated farmhouse. No doubt there would be those this far north and west that were unaware of what had happened in Paris. Having been exposed to deep rural stupidity all over his homeland, John Pearce had no doubt the same depth of ignorance existed here. Not that the tenor of their lives would be upset by knowledge if they had any. They would likely worry more about the seasons than any legislative or national assembly, think more of the health of their livestock before that of a beheaded king or an arraigned aristocrat. Though cold because of the wind, it was not unpleasant due to the clear blue skies and the sharp sunlight, and given time to ruminate, John Pearce surmised that the two nations were probably not so very different, much as the opposite was trumpeted. The French were Catholic and held to be deeply superstitious, while they were also at the mercy of rapacious abbots, bishops, and feudal lords. Was it so very different in Britain? He had witnessed as much foolish belief in demons and evil spirits in shire counties as would exist in any papist country. Most vicars lived very much like French country priests prior to the Revolution, hand to mouth, needing several livings to make ends meet, unlike the princes of the French Church who had amassed wealth beyond the dreams of avarice. Indeed, it was the sequestration of that and the land the Church held which had sustained the public purse following the Revolution. While not as rapacious, neither John Pearce nor his father Adam had ever met an abbot or a bishop in England who was not sleek and well-fed, while around their monasteries and palaces people lived on the verge of starvation, and having attended both high Anglican and Catholic liturgies, he was at a loss to see much of a difference. He and his father had, on the odd occasion, been admitted to the great country estates of Britain's elite, Adam Pearce, the radical orator, having a certain cachet as a house-guest for the outrageously wealthy. The British aristocracy, to his mind, needed no lessons in acquisitiveness from their French counterparts. At some point he stopped his mental condemnation, and with hunger rumbling in his belly, he reminded himself that he was being a hypocrite. He liked good food, wine and clothing, interesting conversation, the company of intelligent and beautiful women, and right now he would sell the soul he doubted he possessed for a carriage to carry him to Paris. He had had disputes with his father's friends in the spring and summer of the previous year about the course events had taken, no longer the dutiful son who agreed with everything Adam Pearce stood for, but a person growing to manhood with his own opinions. How many people had to flee or be proscribed to guarantee the safety of the Revolution? The rise of the good men who had clipped the wings of monarchy had been eclipsed by the subsequent elevation of demagogues who competed with each other to satisfy the dregs of the city, the so-called enragés, who whipped up the passions of an out-of-control mob who had come to be called sans-culottes. It took time for his father's certainty to waver. Adam Pearce was not about to surrender a lifetime of ideas, which had seen him trudge the length and breadth of England to preach, to the reality he saw all around him. Then in early August came the butchery and mutilation before the Tuileries Palace, this followed by the September massacres. That was when Adam Pearce, who in between these two events had been offered and declined a seat in the new National Assembly, had spoken out regarding excess, and he had committed his views to paper, arguing against Marat's call in his journal, The People's Friend, to engage in a merciless struggle with the enemies of the Revolution. He found that the new rulers of France were no more inclined to accept critical opinions than their confrères across the Channel, found that his stock as a long-time radical who had suffered for the cause of freedom counted for a lot less than his unwelcome views. John Pearce mourned for the Paris of the year 91, when freedom had been in the air, and yet still there was an atmosphere of elegance and excitement. It was a time when young John, in the salons of the knowledgeable ladies who ran such things, had attracted attention for his youth, manners, and fine bearing in a society famous for the laxity of its morals. It was also lax in the matter of hierarchy, so John found himself ordered to amuse the likes of Germain de Stael, or a famous wit like Talleyrand, while they, without condescension, openly sought the views of a young man who was not French and knew something of the outside world. He thought of the restaurants and cafes where glittering minds and beauty congregated. Ramponneau, or Le Tour d'Argent, the exciting cuisine of Les Frères Provençaux. There were tableaux, theatres, balls, and the great festivals celebrating freedom. Dozens of encounters surfaced from his memory as he trudged across the muddy, unploughed fields, of meals consumed and wines drunk, sometimes to excess, of beautiful women, and opportunities both taken and missed, the warmest being of Amélie Labordière, the lady 10 years his senior, who had become his mistress, though he recalled that he had been the victim of a seduction rather than the initiator. Her husband was too busy with his own liaisons to care that his wife had taken a lover, nor did he mind that she spent some of his money on presents that turned a gauche young man into a bit of a dandy. It was too good to last. He had watched those salons thin out and cease. It was no longer sensible to openly debate the rights and wrongs of the regime, or to show even a hint of wealth, grace, and good manners. Then Amélie and her husband had disappeared, saying nothing to anyone. One day she was there, laughing, sensuous with delightful vulgarity. The next, like so many others, she was gone. Where he did not know. All he could hope was that her escape had been successful. The Paris he was going back to was a place of caution, if not downright fear, of food riots and increasingly authoritarian government. The thought that came to him then, as he approached the hamlet of Ardres, was that this was the simple part of his journey, alone with only the odd distant peasant to observe his passing. From now on it would get more difficult until he reached the capital itself, at which point it might become deadly. Yet nothing outlined the difference between Britain and France more than what lay straight ahead. He had crossed half of southern England at risk only from his own loose tongue. There were no barriers or officious busybodies demanding to know his name and his reason for travel. He was less than 10 miles inside France, and that obstacle, the first of many he knew he would encounter, stood before him. But he had to go through it, had to get off country fields and onto the road, where he could take a coach from the local auberge, which lay just beyond, it being a regular stop for a change of horses on the Saint-Omer to Calais road. The scruffy quartet of National Guardsmen who manned the Ardres crossroads, crowded around a flaming brazier, watched Pearce approach, and he could almost feel them as they looked him up and down, assessing his worth. The cloak which he had acquired was of reasonable quality, but had fortunately, like his shoes, suffered from the cross-country mud and the need to force his way through hedgerows. He let it fall open to reveal the poor quality of his short blue naval coat, so faded from the original deep blue as to be unidentifiable in terms of which nation he belonged to. The canvas ditty-bag he carried over his shoulder likewise pointed to a young man in straitened circumstances. His tale was ready, and thanks to the Reverend Conway and his skill with pen and paper, as well as the language, he had papers to show that he was a French sailor heading home. He had the advantage that he was heading inland, not towards the coast, so he was unlikely to be an émigré fleeing to safety. But most of all, as he examined the men manning the barrier that stretched across the road, and saw the threadbare nature of their once bright uniforms, he had in his palm a gold coin, and he was sure that would, in the event he could not persuade them otherwise, see him through better than any explanation. "Bonjour, bonsoir," he said, as the men straightened into some semblance of a military posture. The one in charge, a portly fellow with a substantial moustache over a fat face, held up a hand for him to stop and demanded to know if he had any papers. Pearce pulled Conway's folded letter from his pocket and presented it, with an imposing anchor-shaped seal over a 3-strand tricolor ribbon of the same material that made up his cockade, that surmounted by a florid signature. Very likely it would not stand up to too rigorous an examination, but one advantage lay in the fact that in the many changes of government there were no papers of the kind that existed in monarchical times, so that made-up documents could rarely be nailed as outright forgeries. If the fellow could read, which Pearce doubted, he would see that Capitaine de Vaisseau Henri Dumont had given permission for sous-officier Jean-Louis Martin, a good Republican, to leave his ship and proceed to Paris to attend to his dying father. The blue coat, the tricolor cockade he had fitted to his hat, and the sextant poking out from his ditty-bag all proclaimed his profession. The letter gave good reason for his being away from the sea. The guard grunted as he read, trying to give the impression he understood every word, but merely confirming Pearce's suspicion that he was illiterate. What the man said next, about the necessity of the holder of this letter needing to wait until his officer came on duty, underlined that. When Pearce inquired, only to be told that the officer might or might not come by next morning, he began first to plead, then to sob, informing all the guards of the parlous state of his father's health and of his deep need to see him before he expired. It was a telling tale to a Frenchman, for Pearce knew how they felt about family, that they had an almost mystical attachment to blood relations, and a passion almost amounting to morbidity regarding attendance at the point of death. Taking his interlocutor a little away from his fellows, Pearce explained that there was an inheritance to protect as well, working on the other subject for which the French had a mystical regard. It was hardly surprising in the light of such a thing that he was willing to pay to avoid being delayed, and the expert way the National Guardsman palmed the half-guinea coin from Pearce's hand was sound evidence that it was not the first time he had accepted a bribe. The barrier was lifted without further ado, and John Pearce, passing a rather limp and forlorn Liberty Tree, that symbol of revolution imported from America, walked through to the low thatched inn that was the Auberge d'Ardres, where he could eat lobster and wait for a coach, leaving the quartet of guards to split his douceur and laugh at the way they had done their officer. Public travel had to be given up when he got close to Paris. Abbeville had been tricky, Amiens worse, for all the talk on the coach and at each stop was of trouble in Lyon and a royalist uprising in the Vendée, so suspicion, never far away, was heightened. Now, near the capital, there were too many stops, too many interrogations, too many officials with sharp eyes and the temperament to hold him up indefinitely until his papers could be checked. So he first saw the windmills that covered the hill of Montmartre from the back of a farm wagon, having cadged a lift from a farmer heading into the vegetable market to sell his produce, winter greens that had that smell of overused and never-washed stockings. Hat, cloak and coat buried under the produce, and grimy from 3 days of travelling, he looked and felt like a peasant. The driver was a garrulous soul who wished his passenger to know that he had a wife he hated, a useless sod of a son, and 2 daughters he would gladly give away if he had the money for a dowry. This chatter suited his passenger, who wanted to avoid thinking of his reasons for being here. Almost the whole 3-day journey had had him gnawing at the conundrum of how he was to effect the removal of his father and get him home. A second note from Horn-Tuc, delivered in Sandwich, had told him that he was in the Conciergerie, an old medieval royal palace on the Ile de la Cité that had been a prison for 400 years. The place had been overcrowded before John had left, and was hardly likely to be less so now. Well guarded because it held the supposed enemies of the Revolution. The easiest way to get him out of there was intervention by a higher authority. The other way, a bribe, would need to be so massive it was probably beyond his means to pay. Indeed, he wondered just how much he would have to expend just to get to see him. If he occasionally toyed with the idea of a daring rescue, it was only that. He knew the place too well, towering as it did over the river and plainly visible from the opposite bank. Tell himself as he might that continual deliberating on it would produce no solutions, that he would have to wait until he was actually in the vicinity to decide, did not stop him from doing so, and the closer he got to the city gate, the worse it became. The walls of Paris, surrounded by endless rows of housing, looked imposing, but they were of another age. Yet they still preserved their function, and the Porte de Saint-Denis was no exception. It had a full complement of National Guards, properly uniformed and armed, and imperious in their authority, none more so than the officer who commanded them, a choleric-looking individual with an outrageous cockade in his hat, who strode around with his sword scabbard slapping his highly polished boots, all to create the impression that he was ensuring the men under his command examined properly anyone who wished to enter or leave the city. At least Pearce did not have to guess this time. He knew for certain just how venal this lot were, knew that like every fellow who manned the numerous gates that surrounded Paris, the high-coloured officer had probably paid a lot of money for this posting, funds which could only be recouped in one way. This was not the National Guard of the now fled Lafayette, but the successor, manned by rapacious rogues, not honest citizen soldiers. They were on the Belgian border, or the Rhine, fighting the Prussians and the Austrians. So every trader paid their dues, and passed the cost on to the citizens of a capital that seethed with fear of speculators. Quite likely émigrés, should there still be any, could get out of Paris as long as they had the funds and made the proper arrangements in advance, the sum based on their need and their implied crimes, which was why the men who now ran France, and suffered from the delusion as to the number of their enemies, tried to make sure they were locked up before they could escape. Enemies of the Revolution entered Paris even more easily, for the fonctionnaires who manned the gates saw it as no part of their duty to protect anything other than their investment. There was a risk. Every so often they would ostentatiously apprehend some individual, almost certainly someone without the means to pay a bribe, and march him off to the nearest prison. Guilt or innocence mattered less than appearances. The gatekeepers of Paris had to be seen to be doing their duty. Pearce got through for a bundle of paper assignats, the heartily disliked currency of the Revolution, money which went down in value on a daily basis, a stack of which he had exchanged for 1 golden guinea in Saint-Omer. Another couple of guineas had got him some pre-revolutionary coinage, which he needed to buy food, and was useful where an inducement, most in his case, was not worth the expenditure of more than silver or copper. His vegetable grower lost 2 boxes of cabbages from the back of his wagon, and though he cursed the robbing bastards who taxed him, he did so in a very soft voice that they could not hear. In fairness, Pearce gave him some of his assignats to alleviate the loss. Near the vegetable market, still north of the Seine, he retrieved his garments from their hiding-place and parted company from the grateful farmer, disappearing into the maze of narrow streets that constituted the Marais section of the city. From there he made his way down the Rue du Temple to the river, and looked with a creeping sense of despair at the walls of the conciergerie, at the constant stream of people coming and going through the great gate, before crossing the twin parts of the Seine by the Pont Neuf, past Notre-Dame, and heading for the Quartier Saint-Geneviève behind the University of Paris, where he and his father had lived for 2 years. At the house which contained the apartment his father had rented, 3 floors up in the Rue Saint-Étienne-de-Grès, he found a broken lock on the street door, with whatever the place had contained, furniture and possessions, looted. The 2 lower floors, occupied by a maker of coach lamps and his plump wife, had been comfortably furnished, better than that with which he had endowed the floor he rented. Now, what had not been taken had been smashed or wrecked. Not that there was much of that. Some broken chairs, torn drapes, and the shards of a mirror. They looked as if they had suffered in the rush to steal, rather than been left for lack of value. Up the stairs he went, knowing that he would likewise find his own and his father's possessions gone. It saddened him to stand at the open door and survey what had become of the place in which he had so recently lived. It had been cold in winter, and too damned hot in summer, but it represented the only home he could truly say he had shared with his father, for in Paris their travelling existence had stopped, and even if Adam Pearce had things to do, he was for the first time in many years free from responsibilities. Regardless of what was happening outside the cracked panes of glass on the windows, it had been a place from which a youngster might come and go knowing that there was some constancy in his life. Right now it was too painful to look at the bare floorboards, stripped of oilcloth, the empty grate of the fire by which his father was wont to work in winter, oblivious to the smoke which never ever wholly made its way up the chimney, or the missing desk by the window which was flooded by daylight when the sun shone. Pearce turned, went back downstairs and secured the front door, jamming it shut with a sliver of broken timber, wondering about the owners. Had they fled, or been arrested, denounced for a trade that served the wealthy, or worse, caught up just because his father had been arraigned? Whatever, they were gone, so he had a place to lay his head, albeit on a bare floor with nothing but the rags of those torn drapes to cover him. The well in the backyard still functioned, a scoop still in the bucket. There was broken timber for a fire to heat water in, so using the shards of mirror he was able to wash and shave, and that completed, and having hidden his pistol and other possessions in the rear courtyard, he set out to see what he could find. The result was depressing. Most houses he called at were either empty or occupied by grubby strangers who were happy to imply that the previous owner was sans tête. Others, people who had been friends to Adam Pearce in the past, refused to open their doors to the son of a man in prison, lest some sharp eye spotted the connection and denounced them. The church house in Cluny, where his tutor, the Abbé Morland, had lived, was a gutted, burnt-out shell with no one passing willing or able to tell him why or how it had happened. The old abbé had, of course, refused to take the oath to the Constitution demanded by the state, and had thus earned the dubious honour of becoming what was called a non-juring priest, a man loyal to Rome, not the Revolution. He crossed the river to the Hôtel de Ville to see if he could find anyone who might intercede, only to find his way blocked by a crowd of supplicants, all with a grievance, a complaint, or seeking a favour from the men who held the power in Paris Commune. It was impossible to miss the fear that permeated the entire citizenry. Paris had been a city of laughter, the streets as full of costermongers, jugglers, fire-eaters, and hucksters as it was of beggars, pickpockets, and thieves. Now it seemed full of the destitute. Nowhere was this more obvious than around the Palais Royal, home to the one-time Duc d'Orléans, now the self-styled Philippe Égalité, who had voted for the death of his royal cousin. The colonnaded passages that surrounded the palace had been home to all sorts of whores and pimps, pornographers, writers of scurrilous pamphlets, silver and goldsmiths, purveyors of luxury goods, and charlatans, passing off everything from useless patent medicines to false religious relics. It was from the Café du Foie that Camille Desmoulins had started the riot that led to the fall of the Bastille. The Palais Royal had not only survived the fall of that royal prison, it had seemed to thrive on it, its cafes and restaurants and walkways filled to overflowing. Only the pornographers were left now, selling tales, old and new, of the supposed debauchery of the Queen and the ladies of the court. They, the whores, the pimps, and the vendors of the dozens of news sheets which flooded the city, spewing forth bile. Most had long since ceased to be purveyors of news, if you accepted listing, as they did, those who had been condemned to the guillotine, and had become organs for the various ranting editors. Denunciation stood at the core of their polemics of anyone remotely tainted by their own less than objective standards, that and demands for more radical reforms to the way the nation was run, in reality a plea by those who penned them to be elevated to a station where they could put their ideas into action. Further on, along the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, lay the Jacobin Club, and Pearce stopped to look at the message above the door. A mockery, for there was no humanité, indivisibilité, liberté, égalité, or fraternité that he could feel, only the kind of naked power that reduced the people to beggars after justice. He turned away from that, momentarily debating the worth of making for the National Assembly, housed in the Tuileries Palace, when a voice addressed his back. "Young Monsieur Pearce, is it not?" John froze, turning slowly, not knowing whom he was about to encounter. The man looking at him had a handsome if somewhat florid face, thick red lips, and, as he placed the name, a dark colouring that betokened his southern upbringing. He was well dressed, almost dandyish, in burgundy silk, which seemed a dangerous thing to be in such times when black was the colour of choice, but he also seemed to have an assurance that such display, in his case at any rate, was acceptable. The lips were smiling, and there was no animosity in the dark brown eyes. "Monsieur de Cambaceres." "Indeed." He had met Régis de Cambaceres many times, because he was a man who frequented the same salons as those which welcomed young Monsieur Pearce, though John had always tried to avoid too close an association with the man, because, although interesting in a firebrand sort of way, he was a well-known and quite open pederast. That he had gravitated in those salons towards a handsome young fellow and engaged him in conversation was to be expected, but it was under no circumstances, however enlightening, to be encouraged.
"I was given to understand that you had left Paris."
"You know about my father?"
"Sadly, yes."
That was examined for hypocrisy, but to Pearce it seemed genuine, as Cambaceres added,
"Walk with me. It does not do these days to be seen standing and talking in the street. Suspicious minds, of which we have an abundance, see conspiracy everywhere, even in innocent conversation."
"You have come from the Jacobin Club?"
"I have," Cambaceres sighed. "I swear the place becomes more tedious by the day."
As they began to walk, John remembered a conversation he had had with his father about this man, with old Adam wondering how the one-time deputy to the Legislative Assembly had survived when so many of his contemporaries had fled. Régis de Cambaceres had been an original electee to the States General in '89, had taken the famous oath in the tennis courts, had been, if not at the forefront of the revolution, a leading light. Vain, highly intelligent, not given to holding his tongue when he saw political chicanery, he had become a member of the National Assembly as well, voting openly for the death of King Louis, yet not afraid to denounce those who shared the odium of that ballot if he felt they were less than true to the revolutionary purity he saw as essential. The man, in short, was a survivor.
"It was unwise of your father to publish his views."
"Nothing would stop him," Pearce replied. Cambaceres obviously detected the slight weariness in that reply, for he looked at his young companion keenly. "It has been his way all his life, and at least he has been in prison before."
"I doubt even an English jail would prepare him for what he faces now."
"What does he face?"
"It is small consolation," the Frenchman said, avoiding the question, "to observe that he is in excellent company. I dare say with the quality of mind that these rabid dogs have incarcerated, the highest level of debate in Paris today is in its prisons."
Pearce thought it not the sort of remark you made at a time like this if you wanted to be safe. Indeed, it was exactly the kind of expression of opinion that had probably seen his father arrested. "Are you still a member of the Assembly, monsieur?"
"I am, and of the Committee of Public Defence, which is supposed to be the guardian of the revolution."
"Can my father be got out of the conciergerie?"
Cambaceres stopped and looked at the younger man. "You are asking me if I have the power to intervene?"
"I am."
"Alas, I fear not. Indeed, at this very moment, Danton and my pretty young friend Saint-Just are conspiring to edge me off the aforesaid committee, since they find the way I disagree with them so frequently unpalatable. They are in the process of forming a new body, of which I suspect I will not be a member."
"Who, then?"
"Danton could do it, but you must understand, young Jean, that he has Mayor Pache and the beasts of the Paris Commune at his heels, watching his every move, who want to cut off the head of everyone in France with either blue blood or a brain. Quite apart from that, the air is full of treachery. No one trusts our generals not to surrender to the Austrians or the Prussians. Lyon and Marseille refuse to accept the writ of Paris, and there is a full-scale effort to restore the monarchy in the Vendée."
"I believe he was denounced by a man called Fouché."
The reply was non-committal. "Was he?"
"Could I appeal to him?"
"He is not in Paris. Fouché has been sent to Lyon as a representative on mission."
Seeing the look of confusion on John Pearce's face, Cambaceres explained about this new revolutionary office. They carry with them the power of the Committee of Public Defence, soon, I believe, to be renamed Public Safety, and they have the power to impose the revolution by whatever means are necessary. But I am bound to say, even if he was here, he is a loathsome creature to whom I doubt any appeal would be successful. I need help. I can offer you hospitality, food, a place to lay your head, but not more. I desire to keep my head on my shoulders, and pleading for someone denounced by a fellow member of the Jacobin Club, however odious, is not the way to achieve that. There are too many voices in the assembly looking for victims, so that they may prove the purity of their own revolutionary credentials. It is kind of you, but no. The slight smile on Combasser's thick red lips was wet and unattractive. You fear for your virtue. Pearce did not want to offend this man, it being a bad idea to do so when he had no notion of what tomorrow would bring. Let me just say that with all the other things I have to worry about, I would not want to add that to the list. Lightly put, young man, the Frenchman replied with good humour. I recall you had a deft turn of phrase. The offer stands, if you should need it. My home is just along from the Jacobin, the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. It is open to you should you need it, and you have word that hospitality is all I offer you. Thank you, John replied. Now I must go and see if I can visit my father. Then I wish you both good luck. Dispirited, he made his way back past the Louvre and along the banks of the Seine, crossing the Pont Neuf once more to the westernmost point of the Ile de la Cité, a walk around the Conciergerie depressing him even further. The walls were thick, the windows, heavily barred at ground level, were small, the gates massive, closed and well guarded. Eyeing the place provided no solutions as to how to get someone free, but the escorted tumbrel that came out of the massive gate on the far side, with 6 miserable-looking souls stood up in it, 2 women and 4 men, hands tied behind their backs, provided an even more telling reason to do something, though a quick search of the faces relieved him of the worry that his father might be amongst them. As soon as the passers-by spotted them, they reached for some of the abundant filth that lay in the streets and began to pelt the prisoners, and the names they used to denigrate these poor unfortunates left Pearce in no doubt as to their station or their fate. They were condemned souls being taken across and along the bank of the river to la Place de la Révolution, where a gathering crowd and a guillotine awaited them. With a sinking heart he watched them as they rattled over the cobbles, only the bonds that lashed them to the cart keeping them upright, drums playing as their solemn escort marched them to their death. One woman sobbed uncontrollably, the others looked straight ahead in studied defiance. The men had their heads bowed, and all were in filthy rags that had once been fine clothes, evidence of long incarceration. Who were they? What had they done? Probably little, and certainly nothing to warrant the loss of their heads. He fought a morbid desire to follow them. He had seen enough of executions before he left Paris nearly 2 months before, including that of the king. Yet the sight of that tumbrel gave urgency to his needs, and he made his way to the Café Saint-Florian, which lay across a short bridge to the Ile Saint-Louis, the place where those with business at the Conciergerie took their refreshments. If food was short in Paris, there seemed no evidence of it here. Everyone seemed to be able to eat their fill as long as they had the means to pay. It was busy with noisy advocates who were determined not to confine their arguments to a court of law, of men with hooded eyes who looked like functionaries of the state, they who would execute the warrants issued by the demagogues who now ruled France, and who looked at him as if measuring him for arrest. There were 2 sad-eyed-looking individuals, men and women who, no doubt like him, had relatives behind the massive walls that surrounded the nearby prison. It was they who identified for him the men he must talk to, as they sought favours from the guardians who manned the world beyond the gates, and who used this place to trade for the right to either news of a relative or a visit. One seemed more approachable than the rest, a heavy-jowled fellow in a leather waistcoat and a grubby cap of liberty, with a stomach so huge that it defied gravity, that surmounted by a thick belt which had on it a ring for the keys he had left behind. He approached him once the other supplicants had finished, to be greeted by a raised eyebrow and a cynical sneer on a near-round face that spoke volumes. Here was a fellow who knew he was cock of the walk, a man who could demand and get obeisance from those to whom he might formerly have had to grovel. His love of the power he wielded was so obvious that Pearce had to stifle the temptation to clout him and wipe that smirk off his face, his body shaking with the tension that emotion produced. It was doubly galling that the trembling seemed to be evident in his voice, which was taken by the gardienne to represent fear. "I want to go into the prison." A flick of the head preceded the reply, given in the kind of gutter French from the eastern part of the city that would have been incomprehensible to anyone who had not lived in Paris, and the smell of his breath was redolent of garlic and stale wine.
"There be one or two here who'll take you in, if you so desire."
John deliberately juggled a number of coins in his hand, the dull sound of which made the man narrow his eyes, which led Pearce to wonder how often he was offered real money instead of assignat or goods in kind. Clearly he knew the sound of gold from that of copper and silver. "My father is in there." Suddenly he was all concern.
"Then keep your voice down, for those same men will have you up. Blood relative to a prisoner is enough. What's his name?"
"Pearce, Adam, not French." He looked at him keenly then to see if the name made any impression. There were a lot of people in the crowded prison, probably well over 1,000 that he knew, but someone not of French nationality should stand out. Nothing in the blank expression obliged.
"A foreigner?"
Pearce nodded. "I assume it is possible."
"It is, if the fee be right."
Then, annoyingly, he smirked again.
"Seeing as it has to get you out again."
English gold. That was a risk, but one he had to take. The man did not even blink.
"As good as any?"
"One in, and another when I come out." The heavy-jowled cheeks shook slowly.
"Two to go in and out, paid here and now."
That was steep, but being in no position to bargain, Pearce nodded. Yet he did wonder at the sense of what he was doing, knowing that he might himself never get out again. Not for the first time since leaving Colborne's ship he was conscious of being alone, without support, so he added, "I will want to visit him more than once." The gardienne nodded to indicate he understood the message, that there was more gold to come, and Pearce resolved that after he had seen his father, he would ask this turd how much of a bribe it would take to get the old man out. He might not have enough. There might not be a sum that was enough, but there was no harm in knowing. Before they left, he bought some bread, cheese, and a straw-covered flagon of wine. Having been incarcerated before, he knew that they would be welcome. Let in through a heavily guarded postern door that opened onto the Rue du Palais, John Pearce was glad he had not given much consideration to a daring rescue. There had been escapes from the Paris prisons, but that had been in the early days of proscription, before those in charge got their regime properly organized. Walking beside the stout, waddling gardienne, Pearce surmised he had been a royal jailer before he had become a revolutionary one. He had that air about him of a man long in his occupation. Nods were exchanged at the next gate, silent looks that no doubt told his fellow warders that there was a share of something good for letting them through. It was how they made their living, that and fleecing the prisoners for every favour granted. They were cast from the same mould as the Bridewell warders he and his father had had to deal with in London, and while one part of Pearce saw that they had little choice if they were to eat, he could not fathom what sort of man would choose such a life as an occupation. The last postern gate led into a vaulted guard-room, and the gardien took him through a side door from that.
"Can't use the great hall," he said. "Tribunal's sitting."
What tribunal? As soon as he said that, Pearce cursed himself for an unguarded comment, for it had the potential to engender suspicions in the gardien's mind which he would rather not raise. The Paris he had lived in before was daily awash with the rumours of plots and daring rescues, mostly of the royals. Few, if any, were true, but that did not stop the mill of rumour fabricating and disseminating them.
"Where you been? The moon?" the Guardian sneered. "The revolutionary tribunal that, God willing, now that it is sitting permanent, is going to chalk the doors and clear some of the folk out of this place, 'cause I tell you no lie when I say it is bursting at the seams."
"I have been away from the city."
"Then you missed them doing what should have been done this last year. Stands to reason you can't just keep taking traitors up without the sods going somewhere. Not that a few don't die right here. The tribunal will do the trick. Drag 'em in, and if they're innocent, not that there's many of those, they're free. If not, then it's straight out the door to execution, and good riddance."
These words echoed off the walls of a series of dank, dimly lit corridors, which finally brought them to a courtyard surrounded by high walls and windows, crowded with humanity, the hub of noise dying as all eyes fixed on the pair just come through the last postern gate. With a shock, John Pearce realized that the look on their faces was one of terror, not curiosity. They feared the call to that tribunal the Gardien had talked about, to be followed by the tumbrel and the blade, and this is how it would come to them, except it would be a man with their name on a piece of paper.
"One sand glass, then I'll come back for you. Be waiting for me, for I shan't wait on you."
As he moved forward, the crowd parted, no one, given they had no idea who he was, wanting to make eye or bodily contact in case he was the representative of the Grim Reaper. In his cloak, hat, and his bold tricolor cockade, he probably looked like one, and he would have removed the latter so as to appear less threatening if he had not been clasping the provisions he had bought. Scanning the faces, looking for his father, he could not help but notice how much faded grandeur there was in the person and clothes of some of those who looked away, of the same sort as he had seen in that tumbrel. Once beautiful women looking haggard, their dresses turned to rags, men of all ages in Ancien Régime coats that had once been bright, but were now dun-coloured and dirty. Those who had once been fat now had folds of skin hanging off them in the same manner as their now too large clothes, and it took no great insight to see that everyone here was close to starving. He would have asked where they slept and where they eased themselves, if the stench and the bundles of untidy straw that lined the outer walls did not make that unnecessary, and he surmised that each morning some of the bodies that huddled against that wall at night would not move, would not wake to the new day. They would be carted out to be thrown into a common grave somewhere outside the walls of Paris. The regime had more ways to dispose of its enemies than ritualized decapitation. It was common knowledge that there were dungeons below his feet, oubliettes, so dank, cold, and perennially wet that made this courtyard a place to value. A series of large chambers, equally crowded, lay off the courtyard. No cleaner than outside, they at least had the virtue of shelter from the elements. From one he heard the sound of singing, a sweet young male voice intoning the phrases of a hymn, that in itself in this place seeming like an act of defiance. Pushing his way through a watching crowd, John found the source, a young man in a straw-coloured wig that had once been dressed white, and a coat that had once been fine, rendering his chanson to an audience rapt with attention, most with their eyes closed. no doubt seeing behind those lids the better life than the one they lived now. Behind them rose a set of stone stairs that led to the landings above, the space between each riser seemingly the home of one prisoner. The landings and tiny cell-like rooms on the upper floor were just as crowded. Each inquiry he made met with mostly slack-eyed indifference, at best a slow and weary shake of the head. He found his father, eventually, after many inquiries, in a cot in one of those cells, propped up by a roughly made pillow of straw wrapped in cloth. His appearance shocking. The green coat with pale silk facing he had been so pleased with when new, now just as dull as those of everyone else in this place. The already lined face was now skeletal, sunken eye sockets, prominent jawbones, and a mouth that was slack from the loss of muscle. Taking his cold hand and leaning close, John heard mumbled words that were familiar, the same tirade now whispered against all the things the Edinburgh renter had opposed all his life: kings, courts, obsequious lackeys, rack-rent landlords, and the stupidity of those who maintained them by their refusal to risk change. Father. It took several shakes of the hand and repetition of the word to open the eyes, and there was a moment when it seemed there was no recognition. Then just a flicker of the bright blue eyes presaged a ghost of a smile, and as the squeeze was returned, he said, "Laddie." About to say that he had come to take him home, John stopped. How was he going to get him out of here in this condition? He needed to be fed, needed a doctor, for there was little likelihood that the affliction that had kept him in Paris had abated. He felt a flash of anger then. Why had he not been silent? Why had he continued to bait people with the power to do this to him? It did not last long, for John Pearce knew that if his father was stubborn, a man who refused to bend, then it was a trait he had inherited. "Who are you?" Pearce turned to face the gently posed question, to find himself looking into another skeletal face. "I am his son." "Ah, he has spoken of you often, with much pride, I might add." "Do not all fathers praise their sons?" "No, young man, they do not. Most curse them roundly as wastrels until they have sons of their own. Only then do they become indulgent." "Do not argue with the Marquis, laddie," croaked his father, feebly trying to raise himself. "Look what he has reduced me to." "You should remain still, Adam, as I told you. You know how movement causes you pain." As he spoke, John Pearce was looking at the face of this Marquis, and what he saw there was genuine concern. Indeed, if John had not been there, he was sure this man would have come forward to help his father, for he smiled as he said, "You will observe he has not lost the power of disobedience." "He will never lose that, Monsieur." "De la Motte," the Marquis replied, "at your service." John Pearce, as he turned back to his father, had the vague sensation that he had met this man before, but he could not place him. Not that such a thing was unusual, for Adam Pearce had been much feted when he came to Paris by those who had read his writings. Even men who wished only to curb the power of the monarchy and found his republican ideas too radical sought out the new arrival. Old Adam was smiling, albeit weakly, which lifted his son's spirits. "He's a good man, laddie, even if he has some old-fashioned notions about the way the world should be run. I had nothing but a wee space in the courtyard when I came in, but he brought me to this cell and gave me his ain bed." There was a terrible temptation to ask his father what he thought of the revolution now, but it had to be fought. This was no time for debates. Instead, he asked him how this had come about. "I had a few things to say to the Jacobins for no standing up to those who called for mair bloodshed, laddie, and that turd Fouché denounced me in the assembly." I know nothing of him.
A shit of the first order. If there's any blood in his veins, it cannot be seen. Religious 1 minute, then bloodthirsty the next. I tell you, them that has been priests or near to are the worst. Purity they call it, and what they mean is, cut off the head of any man who doesna agree.
The eyes closed and the head lolled back a bit, as though the effort of speaking those words had drained him. "I have brought some food," John said, producing the cheese and wine and half turning to include the Marquis. He did not respond, but there was a great deal of shifting from the two other occupants of the cell. The reply was soft, a whisper, and a slight movement to cut sight of himself off from Adam Pearce. "You brought that for your father. You know he will share it." "There are too many hungry mouths in this place to make any share worthwhile. Feed him, and perhaps it will restore some of his strength." A sudden groan made John spin round again. His father had his hands clutched over his lower belly, and the bony face was screwed up in deep pain. He had seen it before, and in the past had eased it with laudanum before calling a physician. John pulled the stopper out of the wine bottle, and he put the top of the flagon to the thin, pale lips, easing it down his father's throat. It was not laudanum by a long way, but it might help. "Monsieur, I do not have much time, but I have already indicated to the warder who brought me in here that I would return. I will bring with me some laudanum to ease his pain, but I would inquire, is there any way of getting him some medical attention?" "There are doctors and surgeons in this prison, and if you were to ask them, they would say to you what they have said to me. His only hope is to be put under the knife, to be opened, so that the source of his agony can be explored." "It might kill him," John replied, not adding the other thought he had, that if the affliction did not, the surgeons, in whom he had little faith, would. "What he has now will kill him anyway." The Marquis saw the pained reaction of John's face, and once more dropped his voice. "And that says nothing for those ghouls in the great hall who sit in judgment on us." "That was not in existence when I left." "Things change by the day. I fully expect my door to be chalked any day now." Seeing the look of mystification in the younger man's eyes, he added, "It is how they select you for their travesty of a trial, in what we already call the Room of the Doomed. For few come out of it to go anywhere but to their death. A chalk mark on the door is a signal to the guards to take you there. They will condemn me for my rank and my hatred of everything they stand for, even if I helped to bring about the end of the Bourbon. It comes to us all, and it is when we need our faith in a merciful God the most." The voice of Adam Pearce was stronger. Clearly the wine had revived him a little. "Don't listen to him, laddie. He will corrupt your brain with all that superstitious babble." John stood quickly, for he feared he had been in this place too long, and it might just be that the man who had let him in, if he delayed, would not be there to let him out. "I must leave. I will be back tomorrow with more food. Please, monsieur, use what is already here, for you know as well as I do that if it is not consumed it will be stolen as soon as you are both asleep." Then he leant down and retook his father's hand. "Drink the wine, eat the food, get your strength back. You will need it for the journey home." "Home, laddie? I don't think we ever had one." "How much to get a prisoner out?" he asked the gardienne as they emerged into the falling darkness. The answer was depressing. "However much money it takes to replace a head and bring a dead man back to life." "Surely there is a way." "How many times a day do you think I'm asked that? And who do you think it is who sends these folk to this place, and sits in judgment on them in the great hall?
They ain't fools, and neither, young fellow, am I. A bit of coin for a favour is one thing, but taking a gift to get you in for a visit is pushing it as far as I dare."
Pearce thought about a request for extra comfort, but realized that it too was probably beyond the ability of this man. The place was too crowded. So the only thing that presented itself as a possibility was to plead with those who had the power to get his father out. This Fouché being out of Paris would help, and he had good reason to hope that Cambaceres would aid him in getting to the likes of Danton. As he looked for somewhere to eat, he weighed the odds, and felt more comfortable for doing so. What could they possibly hold against old Adam? If they wanted, he would write a recantation under his father's name. The reputation of the revolution was odious enough. It would not be helped by the judicial murder of a foreign national, and one with his father's reputation. He was no threat to their safety, or that of the state. The men who ran France now had to be of a practical bent, and that meant they would surely see that Adam Pearce was harmless. Such thoughts were helped by a bottle of good wine and a proper meal, so that by the time he wrapped himself in those torn drapes to try and get some sleep, he was reasonably confident that he could get his father out of Paris and France. Doubts surfaced with the dawn, to replace the sanguine notions that had comforted John Pearce as he went to sleep, and that followed on from troubled dreams of storm-tossed ships rising and falling steel blades, the contorted face of his father making rabid speeches or screwed up in pain, which were directly related to sleeping on a hard floor and a level of discomfort that made him long for a hammock. The walls of the conciergerie loomed larger and thicker in his imagination, and the previous evening's practical politicians became, in his mind, blood-soaked demagogues, so that by the time he was washed and shaved he was in a far from optimistic frame of mind. Taking extra care, he resolved to find a coat and hat that would be more presentable, for he would need to look as good as possible if he were to face members of the Committee of Public Defence. That posed another problem. He only knew 3 of the names, so he must find out the rest. Buying better clothes than those he was wearing was not difficult. As he had seen the previous day, there were people on the streets so desperate to find the funds just to be able to eat that they were selling anything they could find that another might buy. Chips of stone, supposedly from the destroyed Bastille, ribbons and tricolours, bits of string and used brown paper, of crockery and cutlery, most of which had seen many better days, cracked-looking glasses, strips of cloth, clothing in abundance, some of it better classed as rags, domestic and trade artifacts of every description, and that took no account of those selling themselves, either girls or grown women offering their bodies, or men of all ages offering themselves as menial labour. They only outnumbered by the outright beggars. He returned to the Rue Saint-Étienne-des-Grès with a black coat and breeches, plus a tall hat more in keeping with the present French fashion. That he wrapped in the kind of tricolor band he had seen the previous day when watching the comings and goings from the Jacobin Club, the whole making him look like a man committed to the cause. Changed, with his discarded garments hidden away with his pistol and ditty bag, and well aware he was in for a long day, he made sure of a good breakfast, a pigeon pie, washed down with a pichet of red wine, and it was while consuming that he first heard, then read about the new committee that had been set up. Marat's news sheet, L'Ami du Peuple, hailed the inception of the Committee of Public Safety to replace Public Defence. What difference it made to the people of France, Pearce could not fathom, and he was too well versed in ways of revolutionary slogan-making to pay much attention to Marat's screaming polemic regarding the threats to the people, the movement, the number of traitors waiting to stab the revolution in the back, the criminals in the Vendée and the other major cities who were standing in the way of a new world order, or the need for vigilance on the frontiers of France, and more arrests here in Paris. The ugly little swine had been saying the same things for years. To him, perusing the names, it did make one major difference. Combeferre was not a member. That was a problem he would have to deal with later. The time had come to visit the conciergerie with more food and laudanum, which he brought on the way. The gardien worried him by being late, though he did raise an eye at the changed appearance. That was followed by a grinning allusion to a busy but fruitful morning, which was sickening, for it implied that another batch of unfortunate victims were off to the Place de la Révolution. He then taxed Pearce's patience in the way he dealt with the other supplicants for his favours, seeming to deliberately take his time as he accepted small parcels, probably mostly of food, for those inside. Eventually he came waddling towards Pearce with his huge belly and thick thighs, his hand twitching at his side to indicate that payment must be made before anything else. The coins were slipped into his sweaty hand, and Pearce followed him out of the door, heading for the same set of gates by which he had entered the previous day, just in time to see a distant and full tumbrel turning left along the banks of the Seine, its iron-hooped wheels making an audible death-knell sound on the cobbled pavé. The route was not the same as before. This time the gardienne led him through the great hall, a huge chamber in which their footsteps, under a high vaulted timber roof, echoed on the flagstone floor. The walls were lined with armorial decorations, swords, long spears and shields arranged in patterns that were medieval in appearance, with one wall excepted, that covered by 3 huge drapes of red, white, and blue. Set before these was a long table strewn with papers, the seats thrown back and empty, for, as he was informed, the Revolutionary Tribunal had done their work for the morning, and would not again be sitting till the afternoon. In the middle of the hall was a stall slightly raised on a plinth, which was no doubt the dock where the accused would stand, and passing it Pearce picked up the smell of human evacuation, caused as the victims voided their bodies on hearing their fate. It was a double indignity that few people would lie under the guillotine blade who had not already soiled themselves in a state of sheer terror. Done up to look like a man of the Revolution, Pearce caused even more of a reaction as he entered the courtyard, the door closing behind him with the same admonishment about time and attendance, with those present seeming to shy away from him. It did occur, too late, that such a costume might be unwise in this place, once the gardienne went back through the postern gate. With the inmates mistaking him for one of their persecutors, they might well tear him limb from limb. So it was with head held defiantly high that he made his way through the throng, packages of food and medicine held in plain view. There was no singing, and Pearce thought he detected an even greater air of listlessness than he had the day before. Retracing his steps up to the landing, he stopped abruptly when he saw the great slash of chalk marked on the door to his father's cell, and by the time he got to the doorway and saw the empty cot, his heart was in his boots, the parcels dropping out of his hands. The Marquis was on his knees on the stone floor, silently praying, while one of the other inmates who had been present the day before sat huddled in a corner looking wretched. There was no time for ceremony, no time to wait on another man's devotions, and Pearce grabbed the penitent by the shoulder and hauled him round to look into a face streaked with tears and eyes full of despair. A cry came out from those damp lips, an achingly sorrowful sound, and John Pearce found himself looking down at the balding head of a man who had put his arms around his knees and was, in a mumbling way, begging forgiveness. "Tell me!"
"They came for me. They chalked the door for me. But I was not here, and when the guards demanded the Marquis de la Motte—"
He stopped then, too upset to go on. Pearce wanted to strike him because he knew what was coming, and it made him boil with anger. Instead, he patted the man gently to encourage him to speak.
"Your father answered to my name."
The wretch huddled in the corner mumbled,
"He said, let them take away a man who is dying anyway."
This morning. The head at his knees moved slowly, and Pearce had a vision of that tumbril rattling over the cobbles and disappearing round the corner of the prison. There was no way of saying that there was only one cart in that batch of the condemned. There could have been several. But he had a horrible feeling that he had, unknowingly, watched his own father on the way to the guillotine. He pushed off the weeping Marquis, and he rushed out of the cell, his thoughts in turmoil. Could he get out before the appointed time? Had the Marquis, on discovering the mistake, taken any steps to rectify it, or had he merely sunk to his knees to pray to God? What for? Deliverance, or another man's soul? What was his father thinking about? Him, possibly. The idea that his son might get himself killed trying a rescue. Or was it a last act of defiance? Was he dying? There was no certainty of that. Outside, with proper medical attention, he might have recovered. Maybe they had found him innocent and set him free. Was he now wandering the streets of Paris in a daze? Could he get to the Place de la Révolution and stop the execution if he had been pronounced guilty? With these questions rattling round in his brain, he rushed across the courtyard and banged on the postern door, suspecting that it would be useless. How many of the people listlessly watching him had done that in the past to no avail? But he pounded on, nevertheless, even when one or two of the prisoners started to laugh at his efforts. They were soon joined by others that raised the level of hilarity to such a pitch that, echoing off the high walls, the curious gardienne came to investigate. Pearce was through the door before the man had time to ask for an explanation, and the way he grabbed and tried to drag him away brought forth a string of curses. The breathless explanation did little to enlighten the man, who was determined to stand on what dignity he thought he owned, fists on hips, great belly protruding. Pearce wanted to kill him there and then, but he forced himself to calm down, still breathing heavily as he gave a garbled account of what had happened. The falling face, the look of sadness on the fleshy jowls, had nothing to do with his father's possible fate, more to do with the realization of a lost source of income, so that it was with no great hurry that he locked the postern gate and led Pearce out, again going through the empty great hall, where the vision of his father, standing in that dock, was seared into Pearce's mind. It was tempered by the certainty that Adam Pearce would not have sobbed, would not have soiled himself. He would have looked them in the eye with the boldness that had been the hallmark of his whole life, and sneered at their sentence. It seemed to take forever to get to the outside of the walls. Hat in hand, Pearce ran like a demon for the Pont Neuf, slowing to a walk as he got clear, so as not to alarm those who guarded the crossing looking for suspicious souls. He had to walk across to the right bank, his heart pounding, his mood swinging from hope to despair and back again, until he was off and heading for the square that had once been named for King Louis XV, but was now the place of execution. He heard the faint roar of the crowd a long way off, abreast the Louvre, and knew that the blade had dropped and another head had been held up for the canaille who spent their time watching men and women die, whom they hated without ever knowing. He heard it twice more before he was past the great open space in front of the Tuileries, and he wondered if, in the building that housed the National Assembly, those representatives of the people could hear through the walls the results of their bloody deliberations. The Place de la Révolution was packed, this now a daily diversion for the dregs and perverse of Paris, and trying to elbow his way through the crowd was like swimming in molasses. His size and desperation helped, that and the look in his eye that told anyone who wanted to contest with him that they would have to do so with violence. In his ears another roar, and jumping up he had a vision of a female head held aloft for the edification of the crowd. This was followed by another roll of the drums, the signal for a new victim to ascend the steps, that drowned out by the crowing of the yet-to-be-sated crowd. John Pearce was still only halfway to the guillotine, with the crowd even thicker close to, when he heard the voice. His father had always had the ability to command a crowd, and the bellow he let out silenced them for a moment, though perhaps his son was the only one present who understood the few words he was allowed to say before he was silenced. Where he got the strength from, not only to stand away from his escorts, but to produce such a stentorian cry, was a marvel.
"You who have condemned me will in turn die like me. You have betrayed your principles for your life, but that will not save you.
He never got to say Adam Pearce, which was what his watching and desperate son thought was coming next, for he was seized and thrown down out of sight onto the sliding plank that would take his head beneath a blade already dripping blood. John froze, knowing he was too late, knowing too that even earlier there would have been nothing he could do. He watched as the angled metal began to drop, and closed his eyes as the audible thud declared that it had done its work. His eyes stayed closed, fists clenched, bodies screwed up in despair, as the swine around him cawed their triumph at the sight of another severed head. Then he turned, and with no strength whatever, tried to make his way out to a place where he could breathe, and finding himself in the open spaces of the Champs-Élysées, he leant against a tree and wept. Régis de Cambaceres came to his own door as soon as his servant told him of the despairing young man. The look in his eye, as he saw both the identity of his visitor and his state, a clear indication that he could guess what had happened. In the Paris in which he lived, that took no great leap of imagination. Taking an arm, he led John Pearce into a comfortable, if fussily over-furnished room, and sat him down on a chaise, then went to pour him a brandy. Sitting down himself, he took the young man's free hand and squeezed it gently.
"Your father?"
The story tumbled out, not clear in its order, a mumbled and disordered version of what had happened that morning. Much self-castigation mixed with curses at the regime, the prisons, and even once his own father for the way he had behaved. The reassuring noises that Cambaceres made, to the effect that he should not blame himself, were wasted on John Pearce, who was sure in his own mind that when he had originally left Paris on his father's instructions, it had been as much for his own good as to fulfill any filial obligation.
"You must, young Jean, see it as an act of great courage. If, as you say, your father was convinced of the imminence of his own death, he has granted life to another, and who knows, in the confusion of the world we live in, how long that will last?"
"I want to bury him." Perhaps it was the brandy, perhaps the soothing words, but Pearce was aware of a mixture of feelings, self-pity as well as grief, and it being in his nature to honestly examine his own emotions, the notion that he might be feeling sorry for himself as much as for his father was disturbing.
"That will not be easy."
"Will you help me?" Without letting go of the hand, Cambaceres sat back a bit and examined the young man beside him, aware that from under lowered eyelids he himself was likewise being scrutinized. The florid, heavily patterned silk morning coat that went all the way to the floor was the most obvious signal of the Frenchman's proclivities. But it was in the cast of his features and the movements of his body as well, a softness allied to an arch quality that was most evident in his face. Blue, slightly protruding eyes, clear, well-cared-for skin, but most of all the sensual, almost feminine lips. "Will you?" Pearce repeated.
"I am wondering whether you like me."
That made Pearce look away.
"I doubt that you approve of me, yet you come in your hour of need to seek my help. Why?"
Pearce raised his head to look Cambaceres right in the eye. "I come because I know of no one else to ask."
"And in return you offer—"
"Nothing." Had he said that too quickly, too emphatically? Was the shocked look on the Frenchman's face real or mock? For there was an affected quality to the man. All Pearce knew was that he meant it. He had nothing he was prepared to give this man in return for his help, except gratitude. Combeferre stood up and, going to the mantel, rang a bell before turning and smiling.
"Well, at least you are honest, which is in itself a rare commodity these days."
"I know you are no longer—" Pearce stopped.
He did not know how to say what was in his mind. "No longer powerful? Is that what you were going to say?"
In the absence of a reply, the Frenchman continued,
"I wonder, my young friend, if I ever was. Let us find out, shall we?"
He went over to an escritoire and began to write. Then the quill stopped abruptly, and he turned back to Pearce just as his servant entered.
"I am sorry. I must ask this. What was your father wearing?"
John had to put his head in his hands then, for what Combeferre was asking was obvious. That while it might be possible, even easy, to identify the severed head, there was no way to match it to the body without some description of his father's clothing. In his mind he saw him standing to harangue the crowd, his look defiant, and there was a surge of pride mixed in with his other feelings as he replied, "A green silk coat with lighter facings." What Combeferre said to his servant John Pearce did not hear. The man was gone, and he had another brandy in his hands without knowing how it got there. This time Combeferre sat opposite him in silence, just looking at him.
"I think you are weary, my young friend. I suggest that until my man returns, you should lie down."
The look John gave him then made him burst out laughing, and it was full of humour, not contrived and oddly appropriate even to a grieving son.
"You have a lot to learn, young Monsieur Pearce, about some of your fellow men, but you may rest knowing you will learn nothing today."
John Pearce had lain down knowing sleep would be impossible, so it was a surprise when the door opened and a servant bearing food and coffee entered, and he realized that it was nearly dark. He wondered where he was momentarily, until the events of the day came flooding back. He felt the bile rise in his throat, the feelings of hatred for this city, its inhabitants, and the men who ruled France. What had his father done but question them? So what if he had taken the place of another? He had still been imprisoned. Perhaps he would have lost his head anyway. There would soon be another exodus from Paris when word got round, this time of foreign sympathizers who had come to support the original revolution.
"The master's compliments, monsieur," said the servant, who had been patient.
"He said to tell you that matters have been arranged, and that once you have partaken of this, he will be waiting for you in the salon." The brioche and coffee he wolfed down, yet, eager as he was to find out what matters had been arranged, he looked in the mirror to check his appearance. Realizing that his face was streaked with grime from earlier in the day, the rivulets where he had shed tears now smudged tracks on his cheeks. There was a jug of water and a basin, so he washed that off and adjusted his garments to try and take out the creases that had come from sleeping fully clothed, wondering why he cared so much. Combeferre, fully and elegantly dressed, was waiting for him. He looked keenly at him, then nodded when he saw that, while still grieving, the face was also set with grim determination.
"We have recovered your father's body,
and separated it—" Now it was the Frenchman's turn to stop abruptly, for that in the circumstances was a malapropism. "Thank you," Pearce replied, to relieve him of his embarrassment.
"I have also arranged for it to be taken to be buried in the cemetery of the church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and I have a trap waiting to take us there now."
"Hallowed ground in a Catholic church? I'm not sure my father would approve."
"Let him argue with God should he ever get there, or the devil if he does not."
The trap was covered, and once inside, Combeferre pulled down the blinds to ensure complete privacy. As they rattled across the cobbles and took the bridge over the Seine, Combeferre talked of the new committee from which he had been excluded, which helped to take Pearce's mind off the reason for being here. "We go on because we cannot go back. King Louis had to die, for if he had not, then the threat to those things we have gained would be lost. But the Queen, she with her children and relatives, should be sent back to Austria. I dare say in arguing that I ensured I would not be asked to sit on Danton's Committee of Public Safety." "I am unclear what anyone has gained." "Mayhem now, and it may get worse. But France will never again be under the untrammelled power of a king. After all, we have the example of your own country to follow."
"Where will it end?"
"In peace and prosperity, my young friend, as it always does. But not soon. Like England, we will probably have to find a man with a sword, a Cromwell, to make the world respect us and leave us alone."
"England got a king back."
"Yes, but one subject to the power of the people."
"My father wanted more."
"Perhaps one day it will come, like America.
But I doubt France is ready for such freedoms yet."
The trap stopped, and Combeferre pulled at the blind.
"We must be discreet, as all the others are."
"Others?"
"What is said and what is done are not the same thing. This night there will be funerals going on all over France, even many here in Paris, with non-juring priests carrying out the rituals by which the people were raised. It takes more than debates in an assembly and grand ideas to drive out the religion by which we were all raised."
"The zealots, the enraged ones,
will not come near, lest they find themselves hanging from a rope."
The church, which had suffered much from those zealots, was in darkness. Combeferre led John past the altar and into the presbytery, where a pinewood coffin stood on 2 trestles. The trouble the man had gone to was immense, for Adam Pearce lay with his hands folded across his chest, eyes closed, his neck wrapped in a scarf so that it appeared his head was still joined to his body, that he was still whole. His face was tranquil and in repose, waxy pale but somehow natural, and if the shock of his decapitation had registered, that had been made good by the men Combeferre had engaged to see to the body. John went close, and leaning over, a wave of sadness physically running through his body, kissed his father on the forehead, murmuring not a prayer, just a goodbye. As the lid was screwed on, his mind was full of images of the times he spent in his father's company, of the travails, the laughs, the perils, and the arguments. The grave was dug and ready, the body lowered into it by the light of a single lantern. John picked up a handful of earth and threw it onto the coffin lid, took another substantial clod and placed it in his pocket, then turned away as the men engaged to fill it in started shoveling. "Can I ask you, Monsieur Combeferre, why you have done all this?"
"Yes, you can," he replied, looking at the shovelling gravediggers.
There was in his mode of speech a wistful note, as if he were seeing his own tomb.
"I hope that, should I share your father's fate, someone will carry out a similar service for me."
"My father spoke of you once. He said you were a survivor."
"Let us hope he is right."
"Would you see a stone erected so that people will know he lies here?"
"It will take time, but yes."
John went back to the graveside, now nearly full, and gave the diggers a coin apiece for their labours, then followed Combeferre back to the trap.
"You will stay at my house tomorrow. Then I will give you papers that will get you out of France, swiftly and in safety."
"I thought you had no power."
I have the power to forge Danton's signature, and I still have the seals to make it valid. If I dated yesterday, then the committee on which I served was still in existence. Before retiring, with the promised laissez-passer safe in his coat pocket, Pearce had a servant fetch him quill, ink, wax, and paper. He wrote his thanks to Cambaceres, and left a note with most of the contents of his purse to pay for a headstone, and to reimburse a man whose kindness could not have come cheap, keeping for himself only what he thought he needed to pay for his passage to get back to England, something that was not a heavy expense, given that he could take a coach and then the cartel that ran, war or no war, between Calais and Dover. In another piece of paper, folded over into a package and sealed, he placed the earth he had taken from the graveside, in his mind's eye imagining the day he would make that bastard Fouché choke on it. The packet in his pocket, he left the house as dawn broke without alerting any of the occupants. He stopped at the Rue Etienne de Grey to collect his other possessions, and there was a moment, toying with the old battered pistol and the means to load it, when he considered the idea of immediate revenge. Who to kill, and would one victim be payment enough, or end the descent into chaos which Cambaceres saw coming? Even if he succeeded, all he would do would be to share his father's fate. He wanted vengeance, but it had to be more satisfying than that. With no clear idea of how that might be achieved, he made his way on foot to the Place de Valenciennes, the square from where the coaches to the north departed, with a last look at the conciergerie on the way. Cambaceres' signature and the florid seal of his now defunct committee got him through the Porte Saint-Denis without difficulty, and John Pearce left Paris with heavy thoughts and much doubt, journeying across the northern part of France with a heart that grew harder with every league. Sunshine and Mediterranean warmth made working up the crew of HMS Brilliant so much easier. Stripped to the waist, they were not encumbered by clothing, and just out from port, still full of fresh food, Ralph Barclay could say they were happy. So was he, with a full complement of proper sailors, no outright troublemakers, and a set of officers so eager to please him that all his previous problems seemed like a distant memory. Off his larboard side, sailing on a parallel course, lay HMS Firefly, Davidge Gould obeying his orders to exercise his guns, each vessel supplying a target for the other to aim at in dumb show. He would fire one broadside to keep the men happy, but that would come at the end of the exercise just before they were piped to dinner, and would send them away happy. To fire more meant accounting for his powder and shot, and he was disinclined to do that since he would not know who would first examine his logs, a superior who approved of and lauded gunnery practice, or one that preferred a deck without the grooves drawn by much-used cannon. He was without hat or coat, walking the deck with his watch in his hand, cajoling and encouraging his crew as they ran the guns in and out, in between going through a mime of loading. Some were quicker than others. All were quicker than Devereux. Despite his strength, the huge bone-headed bully was a sore trial on such occasions, being cack-handed and getting in the way of his fellows manhandling the 12-pounder. That he saw himself as a follower to Ralph Barclay, and had hurried to join HMS Brilliant as soon as he heard of his patron's commission, was a trial that his captain just had to bear. He set the men to their task again, noticing that one of the main deck cannon was run in, reloaded, and run out much quicker than the others. He also noticed that one of the crew, and not the man in charge either, was urging on his companions to greater efforts. "That fellow in your division, Mr. Mitcham, he is working with a will." "Name of Walker, sir. I believe he declined a chance to go aboard that merchant vessel you sent back to England." "One of my London volunteers?" Mitcham blinked. He had not been aboard long, but he knew just how that section of the crew had volunteered. "Yes, sir. A good man, and enthusiastic, I would say. A quick learner, who has taken to his new life with gusto. He's working like a real blue-water man,
and as you have seen, he is keen to persuade the fellows on his gun crew, even his gun captain, that they could do better.
Fetch him to me.
Ben Walker was close enough to the two men to have heard the entire exchange, but he made no move until he was ordered to do so. He did not like Ralph Barclay, and albeit that things had eased aboard since Lisbon, he still saw him as the tyrant so described by John Pearce. At moments like these he wished he had gone with them, stayed one of the Pelicans, because Ben hated to be out of the crowd, feared that he might be asked why he had chosen to reside in the liberties of the Savoy from which he and his mates had been pressed. A man did not live in that part of London unless he had a secret. Ben's fear of being singled out stemmed from the fact that he had a great deal to hide.
Walker!
Ben knuckled his forehead in the regulation manner, while Ralph Barclay saw before him a man of slight but wiry build, with bright bird-like eyes and something keen in his expression, an intimation of a degree of intelligence. It was very much part of his duties to spot such people, to separate them from the dull and hidebound herd who would make up most of a ship's crew, and see if they could be brought to a higher pitch of usefulness.
You are rated landsman at this time, is that correct?
Aye, sir.
Mr. Mitcham, I know he is a member of your division, but being of the build he is and eager, I wonder if he would not be better employed as a topman.
I would say, sir, he would be an asset in that department. Ben Walker was thinking they were talking about him as if he did not exist, and it made him angry.
In that case, Walker, I shall rate you able, and I will have you report to the yeoman of the sheets after we have finished this exercise. Carry on.
Obliged, Your Honour. Ralph Barclay was satisfied. He had done a good thing, rewarded effort, and taken a man from one station to another where his skill would expand, and so would his usefulness to the ship. As he walked back to the quarterdeck, he spied his marine drummer, a boy called Martin Dent, and noticed the eruption of spots on the lad's face, that and the fact that he was growing out of his red coat. Time to transfer him as well, and seeing he was nimble, he could likewise go to the tops. No ship wishing to be called a crack frigate could have too many topmen.
"Right, Mr. Glaister," he called to his new premier. "Let us have one more go and see if we can't knock a few seconds off our time. You starts on the main course, what'll give you plenty of practice, and I can see how you fare."
"Bugger that," said Martin, his voice a breaking croak. "I can get to the masthead quicker than any sod aboard."
The yeoman of the sheets, who had charge of the topmen, just grinned, for he knew the boy well. A sea brat, Martin Dent had never really had a father, and outside the navy never really had a home. He was cheeky, a bit of a tearaway, but liked by the crew, and it seemed that the broken nose he had got just before they weighed had helped to make him look more like a man. But he needed to be put in his place if he was going to work aloft, where there was no room for skylarking, for that got folk killed.
"Happen you can, Martin, but you's an unruly bugger, so you will start where I say and do as you're told. And you can look after Walker here. If he falls and spreads his guts on the deck and the captain hauls me up, I can blame you."
The pair of new topmen eyed each other with deep suspicion. Martin had been part of the press gang that had raided the Pelican. John Pearce had broken his nose that night, and the boy, seeking a settling of scores, had come close to maiming him more than once. Worse, in seeking out Pearce, he had brought about the death of one of the friends Ben had worked and lived with. To say he did not trust him was to underestimate the dislike he felt. That the lad had behaved better later on, in fact had gone out of his way to be friendly, had not laid the ghost of his first transgression.
"I ain't no wet nurse," Martin growled.
"You are what I tell you you are," said the yeoman, "and you stay there till I tell you otherwise. Now get up them shrouds and let me see what you make of 'em."
Both ran for the shrouds, Martin besting Ben by a whisker. He also climbed quicker, but that did not bother Ben, for he watched his every move, and swore to himself that soon he would beat that boy and become the best topman on the ship. He had decided to stay for one reason.
He had never found a better place to hide from his past than this. Compared to the Navy, the liberties of the Savoy did not come close.
"And who, Mr. Glaister, first got you into the service?"
The Premier, golden-haired and blue-eyed, rested his knife and fork as if the moving of those and answering a question were mutually exclusive actions. That was in the nature of the man. A West Highlands Scot, he was measured of speech, never hurried in his movements, but efficient in a quiet way. Sandy-haired, all skin and bone, with thin, high cheekbones, he looked fragile enough to break, but had shown himself to be tougher than he looked, and pleasing to the man who had posed the question, who hated to see laxity in the pace of any other. A slow sailor, when Glaister was on deck, could expect a knotted rope on his back.
"Admiral Duncan, sir, though he was, of course, Captain Duncan then. My mother is a first cousin to his wife." "Then he has seen to your career in the proper manner?" "He has shown me nothing but kindness, Captain Barclay. When I passed for lieutenant at a board he had the kindness to arrange, he got me a place with Captain Elphinstone. He, in turn, made representation to the captain of HMS Britannia to get me a berth on the flagship."
"Damned Scotsmen," thought Ralph Barclay. "They're like a second tribe of Israel. They get everywhere and feather each other's nest."
"Do you still write to Admiral Duncan?"
"I do, sir."
"Then I hope you will mention your new berth."
"I will praise it, sir, and not only for the worth of the ship and its commander," Glaister nodded to Emily Barclay then, "but for the added benefit of the delightful company at table." The table had become a daily affair, a proper dinner with at least one of the ship's officers and mids invited to join them. Fairmelow, not unlike the Premier in looks and colouring, but better built, was at the far end, the space between his mouth and his plate something of a blur. The other officers were below in the gunroom eating more common fare, bulked out with their private stores. "I do hope the food will get a mention, Mr. Glaister."
"Excellent as it is, madam, it does not compare with the kindness of the hostess."
"Ahem!" The noisy clearing of the throat had the knife and fork back in Glaister's hands and the food to his face to cover his embarrassment, for he had allowed his attraction to get the better of his manners. Lutyens, the other guest at the table, was wondering what Ralph Barclay expected. He had an exceedingly attractive wife. He was on a ship with only one other female, the broad-as-she-was-long gunner's wife, and a group of 140 souls deprived of that which they wanted most in the world, something they suspected he was enjoying on a daily basis. To react to compliments to Emily, to express such an obvious pique, was foolish. "I am told that your part of the world is a place of great beauty, Mr. Glaister," said Emily.
"It is sparse, but it is a wonder. High rolling hills, deep glens, and sudden sparkling lakes. If you are fond of weather, Mrs. Barclay, there is no better place in the British Isles. I swear on one day I have seen every combination of snow, rain, mist, and sunshine imaginable. You can sit down to your soup in brilliant sunshine, and be bound in by mist before the bowl is half done. By the time you are finished, it has rained and stopped, and the snow is falling through sunshine." "Sounds damned uncomfortable," said Barclay.
"It is home, sir, and does one not always hanker after that?" Ralph Barclay had a vision of his own hometown then, and it was not an entirely comfortable one, beautiful as Frome was, nestling in a deep Somerset River valley. It had been a place where he had for several years, as a half-pay naval captain, been forced to stretch his credit to the limit to keep up the standing of himself and his sisters. The way tradespeople to whom he was indebted assumed an acquaintance that hinted at equality was enough to make him shudder every time he thought of it. But there had, of course, been Emily, and a wedding he could hardly have dared to hope for.
"What about you, Mr. Lutyens? Do you hanker after home?"
"I am more attracted to the idea of experience, sir."
"Yet you have given up much to be here, have you not?"
Lutyens knew that Berkeley was probing again. It had become a tedious habit since his wife had instituted these dinners. The captain was fascinated with anything to do with the life of the court, and would swing the conversation round to that regardless of what the surgeon tried to do to avoid it. Best to take it head on and get it over with. "I have given up tedious journeys to Windsor, that is true. That and standing with my father in a draughty audience chamber, waiting for a monarch who has a poor sense of punctuality, and is parsimonious to the point of being a miser in the article of firewood." "Is that not lèse-majesté, Mr. Lutyens?" asked Emily with a devilish smile. "It is the truth, I regret to say. When he does attend his levee, the king is wont to bark at whoever he is addressing. He has a most bulbous set of eyes, and he fixes his quarry with those as if expecting to be misled. With his sons he is sure of it, and they rarely escape without a tongue-lashing for their dissolute way of life, embarrassing to them and to all who are obliged to overhear it. The most annoying thing is when King George fails to turn up at all, and we are left standing around shivering as the fire dies out."
"His health?"
"Is never mentioned, Captain Berkeley. To the nation he is fully recovered from his malaise and in total command of his faculties."
"Would you, with your connections, not know the truth of that?"
"My father may pray with the Queen, sir, and even occasionally with his Majesty, but if he has observed any recurrence of his madness he has not told me, and I think you would agree, neither should he."
"Of course,"
Ralph Berkeley replied, trying and utterly failing not to sound thwarted.
"Mr. Firmilo," he barked, bringing the boy's head sharply up, "when I invite you to my table, it is to engage in social intercourse, not merely to stuff your face with food. You're supposed to be a young gentleman, so it would behove you to behave like one."
Some of that food escaped his mouth as he replied, "Forgive me, sir." "Come, husband," said Emily with a warm smile aimed at Firmilo. "Let him feed. He gets little enough in the mid's berth."
"She's done it again," Ralph Berkeley thought. "Checked me publicly again."
The other thought he had centred round his own inability to remind his wife of her place, and looking at her, masking his ire, he did not see that he was being observed by an amused Lutyens.
"Sail drill after dinner, Mr. Glaister. We will have an hour before the sun begins to set."
"Aye, aye, sir."
All the officers were on the quarter-deck by the time Ralph Berkeley emerged, each hat lifted to acknowledge his arrival. He made his way to the windward side, his preserve as the captain, and paced back and forth for several minutes, head bowed as if in deep thought. In reality, he was enjoying the demonstration of his power. Nothing could happen till he said so. His officers, the master, Mr. Collins, the new marine officer, and all his midshipmen were waiting on his command. It was the sweetest part of his office. He looked over the bulwark to the south where Africa lay, smelling the wind that was coming off that continent to see if he could pick up any of the burnt scent of the land. Though not perfect, it was steady, and it would strengthen slightly as the heat went out of the day, and he had a mind to see what his ship could do. Then, as if he had made a sudden decision, he snapped his head round and went to stand by the wheel. "Quartermaster, ease off a few points. I want the wind playing on our sails to best advantage. Signal Captain Gould to hold station on us. Mr. Glaister, all hands on deck to make sail." The whole ship had been waiting for that, warned in advance to expect it, so the crew rushed onto the deck in record time. In the main it was not done to please their captain. Many heartily disliked Ralph Berkeley, but they had a sharp eye for their own comfort, and they knew that if he was content, then their lives were eased. Make him unhappy, which had already happened on this commission, and they all suffered in the backwash. "The gallants aloft, please, Mr. Glaister." The Premier raised the speaking trumpet, for once his measured way of doing things irritating, and called out the requisite orders. The topmen had gone to their stations, and ropes appeared from the main and foreyards ready to haul up the topgallant yards once the lubbers below had hauled them out and bent on the sails. They were hauled aloft, chained, and on command let loose to be sheeted home on the lines that ran to the cleats on the deck. Immediately, as the wind took them, HMS Brilliant heeled.
"Mr. Farmiloe, my compliments to my wife. She should get my steward to secure anything of a fragile nature, since we're going to heel more as we continue."
The skysails and an outer jib followed the topgallant, and the deck canted a few degrees more, the blue water of the Mediterranean bursting white and fairly creaming down the leeward side.
"The log, Mr. Glaister, let us see what we are making, and let us have out the stunsail booms ready to be sent aloft."
By the time the sun began to set in their wake, Ralph Barclay had everything set he could, and he began to play with the tension on the sails to improve the way they all drew. Mr. Collins, the master whose department this was, agreed with every suggestion he made, for he had come to have much fear of his captain's temper and the man's uncanny ability to expose his weaknesses.
"They'll be taking it all in 10 minutes from now," said Martin Dent.
Ben Walker just nodded as the boy continued.
"You ever been right up to the masthead, Ben?"
That got a headshake.
"It'd be grand up there. Best spot on the ship. What say we go up and have a look-see?"
The yeoman said we was to go no higher than the mainyard.
"Stuff him, mate. What does he know? I'm going up to watch the sunset. If you ain't game to follow me, so be it."
Martin had reached the bulwarks before Ben reacted. He had to go, for it was like a challenge, and he knew he had a flaw in his nature in that he could never pass up on one. So he followed Martin up to the maincap, eschewing, as the boy did, the lubber's hole, and carrying right on to the next set of shrouds. They passed to the tops in the same fashion, Ben climbing in Martin's wake until they reached the topgallant yard, where the boy slipped along, hooking his arm round the smooth pine of the mast.
"Take the other side, Ben, and look around you. If we was to stay here long enough, it'd be dark on deck and still light up here, and there's a wonder of the world, even if I say so."
In truth, there was nothing to see but that setting sun and an expanse of water turning from blue to grey, but Ben was exhilarated nonetheless. Then he looked down, and the case was altered. Swaying forward, he could see the dip of the bowsprit into the water, watch the trails of the accompanying dolphins criss-crossing the bows, and see the flash of their wet backs as they took their leap.
"Ben!"
What? He had to look at Martin Dent, for the tone with which the name had been said demanded it.
"I need you to know that I was sorry for what went before. I never meant no harm."
"Martin, that ain't true. You meant harm to another."
"Then I regrets it. Do you believe that?"
Ben Walker was about to say no when he remembered his own past deeds, things he regretted with every ounce of his being, actions which, had they not occurred, would not have seen him in the Liberties nor pressed into the Navy. Perhaps the boy was genuine, and like him.
"I wants us to be friends, Ben, true messmates, and if you will grant that, I can live with my errors."
"They haunt you?"
"They do, Ben, and I can see no way out since all the others on the edge of my harm have left the ship. But for you to forgive me—"
Ben looked hard at the boy, at his pleading, spotty face.
"Do I have the power, Martin?" "Can't think of another that does."
"Then you have it," Ben said, wishing in his heart that forgiveness for his sins could be brought about by a similar absolution.
"Mates,"
said Martin, holding out his free hand.
"I'll look out for you, and you look out for me, through thick and thin."
Ben put out his hand and said, "Mates." They heard the commands from below as Lieutenant Glaister gave out the orders to take in sail, that followed by an angry shout from the yeoman of the sheets.
"You two buggers! What in Christ's name do you think you are about? Get down out of there, now!"
John Pearce watched HMS Griffin anchor with mixed feelings. He had no affection for the vessel, but a great deal of regard for the pelicans on board, and a feeling that he owed the trio a great deal. Every time he recalled the looks he had received on departure, his heart contracted with shame, forcing him to remind himself for the 1000th time that he had had no choice. Coming back to this place was something he had to do, maybe just because staying in London had been impossible. Having informed Pastor Lutyens of his father's demise, he had then asked Horne Tooke to send the information to the various journals that came out daily in the capital, to be disseminated all around the country. He read them all in a coffee-house over the following week, to discover that to most it was a footnote in the great drama being enacted across Europe. Some saw the story as due and divine retribution on a well-known troublemaker, others a further disgrace on a revolution that had lost all claims to legitimacy. Even the odd writer who reckoned it a slight to the nation. None gave Adam Pearce his due, nor praised any of the tenets by which he had lived. How the world had changed in under 4 years. The only good news was that the warrant on his father, which had included him only as an accomplice, had lapsed with his demise, leaving him free to travel openly. Changing back into his midshipman's uniform, he had sold the clothes he had bought in Paris for more than he had paid, which gave him the means to eat plain, if not plentiful, on the way. It had been a long and slow journey from London back to Lymington, on foot, on the back of a cart where he could beg relief, the whole carried out with an utter lack of real purpose, given that the aims that he was pursuing were exceedingly vague, if not downright confused. That had not changed on arrival, as he stood looking out over the narrow estuary that led out to the Solent. Colborne's boat put off almost before the ship was tied off to the buoy, as he knew it would, he being obliged to hand his papers and his revictualling requirements in to the Commodore, who, no doubt, saw it as part of his professional duty to be impatient. He felt a strange sensation in his gut, brought on by nerves at what he knew was going to be a difficult encounter, and he moved back from the edge of the quay to a point where those manning the boat could not see him, to a point where he could meet the ship's captain face to face and in private. Another very public humiliation was the last thing he wanted. "God in heaven!" the man exclaimed as Pearce stepped out in front of him. Clearly he felt threatened, for he held out the oilskin case containing the ship's logs and papers as if to defend his body. "I wish to speak with you, sir." Pearce was careful to make the "sir" sound like a remark between equals rather than an acknowledgment of the man's rank. "If you will indulge me." "What about?" "The possibility of rejoining the ship." "Damn you, Pearce, you are not short on effrontery." "Or need. I ask for a few minutes of your time to plead my case. Then you can say yes or no." "I do not have the freedom to indulge you. The Commodore has made my number and right now will be examining his wall clock and wondering why I am taking such a devilish long time to obey his orders." "After you have seen him?" "Why should I?" There was no choice but to be an open supplicant, much as Pearce hated the idea. "I need your help." Much as he tried to mask it, Colborne was intrigued, and Pearce could see that his instincts were at odds with his curiosity. Clearly he had not heard of his father's murder, hardly surprising, given he spent almost his entire time at sea. "Go to the Angel. I had intended to take breakfast there." "May I ask how long?" "It is pointless asking me, Pearce. If you really want to know, you should make inquiries of the Commodore." "I will wait for you outside." Standing outside the Angel exposed the truth that was the underbelly of the seeming prosperity of the place. There was not a space in any English town that was not occupied by layers of desperate people, and Lymington was no exception. Poor souls hung around the Angel Inn, hoping for something, anything, like the chore of catching hold of the horse traces as the post-chaise arrived. Having seen to that, they would grovel for the right to carry a traveller's luggage, and someone leaning against the wall, a stranger in a cloak, fit, strong, and clean, might steal from them that job. Even the urchins who hung around hoping for a note to carry looked at Pearce with suspicion, wondering if he was a rival for the coin that task would earn. The crossing sweeper, who kept the road in front of the inn free from dung, got very busy, for he would be questioning if his job, one of the lowest in the pecking order, was being eyed up, with good reason, for there was always a desperate cove who would go to the owner and offer to do the job for less than the scraps of food he was given to eat and ullage he received to drink, spilt beer gone flat that would otherwise be thrown away. The beggars, even ones supposed to be blind, were cursory in their examination, for he was too whole and well set up to threaten them. Likewise the raddled whores peeping out from the alleyways who would prance and display themselves when a conveyance, or anyone prosperous, came past. The one who decided to inquire after his purpose reminded Pearce of Charlie Taverner, a sway in the walk, once good clothes, just too far down the side of worn, the big insincere smile and the hand inside his coat, which could well be holding on to a cudgel.